Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project, a project based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And I'm sitting down here to have a conversation with Domenic Scarcella, who is the author of the book Good Neighbour, Bad Citizen. He also has a Substack by the same name, and I will put links to his work for you to check out. And I highly recommend you do. I've just read his book and it's great and a really easy read. I was just telling him before we went on what an easy read it is. Before we get into our conversation, I just want to pass it over to Domenic just to say sort of thank you for taking the time to have this conversation and perhaps just introduce yourself briefly.
All right. Thank you, Matthew, for the invitation to be here and to talk. Yes, my name is Domenic Scarcella. I live in the United States in along the eastern seaboard there in state of New Jersey. And yes, I did write a short book. That's why it's an easy read because it's not a very long book. About 2.5 years ago at this point, and then yes, launched a Substack where I continue writing weekly. I also podcast weekly, so I'm exercising my old media professional muscles. That was my first career. Was working in newspapers. If anyone remembers newspapers, actually printed papers that people would buy and hold in their hands and read. Old writer and editor among other jobs I've had through the years, and now I just look for opportunities to speak with people about what I call good neighborliness and the inevitable bad citizenship that comes from it.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember physical media as well. It seems like a distant memory sometimes, but it's nice to have sometimes something to hold in your hand and actually, as much as it's great that we can read and watch and listen to things online, sometimes it is nice to just be able to sit down with a book in hand or put on a CD or record if you're listening to music. It's just that kind of process of owning an album or owning a book or it's just, I don't know, there's something about it that's a little bit different from just consuming online all the time. So yeah. And as I say, I checked out the book myself, found it a incredibly easy read, got to the end before I knew it. It's I like the message, and I just want to ask you a little bit about kind of where your motivation came from this, because the good neighbor, bad citizen distinction, obviously, as anarchists, and we're both anarchists. I'm not a Christian myself, but I have a kind of familiarity with Christianity. I have a lot of family and friends who are Christians, and I grew up in a Church of England school, so I had plenty of Bible stories taught to me as a kid, and that. So I'm not completely alien to it all, but as I say, I'm not a Christian myself, which is another reason why I found the book strangely compelling. Because going into it, I thought, well, how much am I really going to get out of this? And I actually think it's probably equally compelling for someone who's not a Christian as it is for somebody. I mean, I imagine it would be for somebody who is, because obviously, it relates to something that they're already into and gives it a different angle. And well, let's look at it, from this kind of perspective. But also, I think even people that don't believe in it, just the basic lessons and this good neighbor, bad citizen distinction that you kind of throughout the book, obviously describe how Jesus embodies this. I just perhaps hand over to you to sort of embellish a little bit more. But the good neighbor, bad citizen distinction is something that also appeals to anarchists, because obviously, we're very adamant about, well, we don't necessarily want to be good citizens and all the things that that entails, particularly when it comes to following government authority, which we reject. But we do want to be good people. And part of what drives us to this non-aggression principle is that desire to not just have our own rights respected, but also to respect other people's, and that reciprocity. And I want to ask you about this perhaps a little later in the conversation after we kind of speak about your book. But also, I feel like there's a kind of synergistic relationship between the non-aggression principle and the golden rule, with the non-aggression principle being a kind of more basic foundation of, don't do this, don't hurt people, and all the rest of it. Whereas the golden rule is obviously a more lofty, treat people better than just not hurting them, how you would want to be treated yourself. It's a higher standard, but I feel like it sits on that lower foundation without conflict, because the non-aggression principle would be within the golden rule, but the golden rule kind of goes beyond that and says, do a little bit more than just not robbing and attacking everybody, so yeah, so sorry, I went on a little bit there, but getting back to the good neighbor, bad citizen distinction, perhaps you could just kind of flesh that out for people listening, what you mean by that.
Okay. I thought you gave a good synopsis of the tension there. As anarchists, we're still social creatures. We still want to engage with other people. We just have to find ways of doing that that come from an insourced ethics rather than simply looking around and saying, do I have permission from somebody to do this? How am I, what's the status of this person? What's my status? Am I above them? Are they above me? Being able to deal with people without falling into, I think you used the word trap at some point, the trap of citizenship, where it really is a trap to be in that mindset all the time. I tried to break it down very early. It's the first page of the book. I gave a series of comparisons between what it means to be a neighbor and what it means to be a citizen. And I wrote, good neighbors treat each other as peers. Good citizens treat each other according to official status. Good neighbors seek the personal, intimate betterment of themselves and each other. Good citizens seek the external validation of an impersonal system. Good neighbors align to voluntary, open-ended interactions. Good citizens align to coercive civil authority and imposed hierarchical social order. Good neighbors insource their ethics. Charity and friendship are the key virtues of their relationships. Good citizens outsource their ethics. Compliance with the commands of rulers and enforcers is a fundamental and necessary aspect. Some might call it a civic virtue. Good neighbors consent. Good citizens conform. So I wanted to do a couple of things there right at the beginning of the book, as I wanted to not only distinguish the two of them, neighbor and citizen, but I didn't want to make neighbor just being the negation of citizen. I wanted to show that there's a substance to being a good neighbor. The non-aggression principle, and really a lot of anarchy, gets a bad name because it's a word that just means not. I mean, it's the absence of an overarching ruling structure. Christianity sometimes gets the same bad name because the most common thing that people who know about Christianity is, say, the Ten Commandments from the earlier Hebrew scriptures. And those are mostly dominated by things not to do. So a lot of people reject them because they say, well, I don't just want to go around avoiding things. I want to do things. And so my goal right off the first page of this book is to show people that there's a substantive, positive way to behave in the world that is not dictated by an impositional social structure.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and you made the point in just what you said with regards to the fact that there doesn't have to be a conflict between a good citizen and a good neighbor because it depends on the social structure that you're living within,
right?
But that is the problem with the good citizen ethos, is if you're going by that as your guiding light, then if you're in a bad system, you're going to be a bad person. And I mean, obviously, an obvious sort of example people could use today is that a good German citizen during World War II obviously wouldn't have been a good neighbor to his Jewish neighbor, perhaps, so that's an obvious example. And obviously you make the example with regards to, I don't think you called them good citizens, I think you called them good cops with regards to the people who ended up crucifying Jesus, physically. I mean, those are ways in which I think it can be sort of hammered home, because like you say, it doesn't, you can be a good citizen and a good neighbor, but if good citizen is your kind of guiding principle, then you're at the mercy of whatever system you're under, and usually that's some kind of an evil system, because governments of all kinds, as anarchists, I'm sure we'll agree, are all different degrees of evil. There are worse and there are better, but they're all, they're all bad. So I think that's a real important, and obviously that's the part that obviously resonates with the anarchists, in me and in people that might read it. And I think that's what I kind of like, and sort of reiterate my point with regards to the golden rule and that kind of relationship is, as anarchists, we all agree with regards to that, what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't harm each other and stuff like that. But it doesn't really guide us beyond that. It really just says you own yourself and you have the right to, you live your life as you do, as long as you don't violate others' exact same right over themselves. But there's no other guidance in there, and that's why I feel like this golden rule has a lovely synergy within that, because it can just sit on top of that and just say, okay, well, on top of respecting people's rights, maybe help them if they're in need, maybe offer kindness, maybe offer encouragement, maybe do your bit to make the world in which you also live in a bit better. And there's also that kind of mirroring of reciprocity. The NAP, is about reciprocity of rights, and the golden rule is about reciprocity of spirit and of kindness and of how we treat each other. So yeah, that's the kind of like I say, even though I'm not a Christian myself, that's the kind of the good that I sort of see within Christianity. Certainly what I see within my family and friends who are, obviously in my mind, positive examples of what a Christian can be. But also with regards to the mission, and this is another reason why I like this book, because it doesn't beat you over the head with this kind of, Christian to anarchism thing. It really just kind of suggests it and implies it at different stages. So I suppose I'm kind of curious, when you wrote the book, did you want to kind of make that connection, or is that just something that's kind of happened organically? You wanted to make this larger point about the good neighbor, bad citizen, and the kind of connection to anarchists maybe just more of a happy accident that's perhaps subconsciously motivated by the fact that you are an anarchist, or was it more of an intentional thing? Did you want to kind of show that kind of mirroring?
It was intentional to show the harmony. In fact, I describe my Substack that way. It's the harmony between Christianity and anarchism. I got to anarchism and voluntarism through a deeper study of the Gospels, because it became unavoidable to me if you look at how Jesus acts in the world. And you look at the things he does, but also the things he refuses to do. It's anarchism. It's so thoroughly a voluntary, consent-based, peer-based mode of being, in a sense. And that's why I make the distinction. You're right in the title of the book, Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen. Is that you brought up that maybe if you're in a very good society, then good neighbor and good citizen might align better. And they might, but that's a chance you're taking. And so what I'm trying to encourage people to do is focus on their attitude and their mindset and what they derive the deepest meaning from in their life. If you derive meaning from being validated by other people constantly, like that's, I mean, obviously we seek cues from other people as we interact. But if your deepest meaning and your highest value is just external validation, that puts you in danger. It doesn't put you in an obvious immediate danger because you're getting along with people. You think you are. But I think you're in danger of losing your own soul. You're losing the ability to, as you described the Germans in the 1940s, 1930s, you're using the ability to be critical, think critically, and evaluate critically the messages that you're being sent. And you're also giving up the ability to be self-critical about the messages that you send other people. So it's a book about reevaluating your attitudes, and not just your attitudes, but how you express them. And I think that's always going to be the distinction. Like if I'm in a society where somehow we're all in a consent-based arrangement. There are some free cities around the world I've heard of, the free cities movement. I follow a writer who writes about one in Latin America called Morazan. They're small enclaves, obviously, because if everybody's consenting, then it's not going to be a large scale project. It's going to be a smaller community that does their best. And I've heard about other examples like that as well. And even if I were in there, my mindset would still be good neighbor, not be a good citizen. Like if the citizen thing happens, okay, but that's an accident. Good neighbor is my intention. If the accident of good citizen happens as a side effect, okay, I'm not going to reject that. But my intention is to have a positive way of being in the world that respects not only my natural human rights, but even understanding them as natural human rights means I should extend that to every other human I meet. So that's my intention. That's where I start from as I act in the world. And the results, okay, if I do my intentions uh, and my treating of other people well, then I can accept the results, even if it means I'm an outcast, which I am, an outlier. It happens. I'm okay with it. And I wonder if you I don't know much about your background, but you might be an outcast in your larger society. I imagine you would be. I don't see the UK as being all that anarchist at the moment, especially.
Well, I feel certain that there's um, a sentiment that within that needs awakening, but yeah, on an overt level, no, we're definitely not. But
We're
anti-government
both
sentiment.
outlaws, right? We're
Yeah,
outliers and
yeah, yeah.
outcasts, and we're the people on the underground doing our best, knowing that there's something that we have to push against.
Yes, and I think like going back with like the whole good citizen thing, I think it's kind of a little bit like the sheep mentality. There's a certain perceived security in kind of going along with the flock, having a shepherd and just following. You can turn your brain off. You can, and and I feel like for a lot of people, it's probably almost like perhaps almost like a calculated risk in their mind, like you know, things will probably be okay if I go along with whatever things are. But as you say, the problem, and it's not just about who you want to be, although that's a big part of it, I think, but also it's about, like who do you want to live next to? Do you want to live next to a good neighbor who, because what you're getting from a good neighbor that's consistent, and that's because, like you say, it's defined by those that reciprocity and that spirit, and that kind of respect for each other. Whereas if you live next door to a good citizen, like I say, depending on the scenario of where you are, they could be your worst enemy simply by the fact that they are a quote unquote good citizen. And like I say, that's a point that's well made in the book. There's lots of little bits, because you do the stations of the cross, and you kind of go through like the stages, and there's lots of little moments that kind of echo it out. But it almost culminates with the example of the good cops,
Yep.
obviously kind of crucifying them at the end. But there's it kind of builds up to that slowly. There's like lots of little kind of perhaps more subtler kind of hints towards it, and then at the end of it just kind of says, and this is where it gets you, kind of thing. This is this is where we are. And because it's such a, like I say, even for people who aren't Christians like myself, but grown up in the West, and in what is very kind of culturally Christian, if you like, we're all kind of familiar enough with the very kind of broad strokes and the basic beats of the kind of story of exactly who the good guys and bad guys are in that story. And I mean, I have a very kind of anti-cop sentiment even today, but when we were taught those stories as a kid, there was no kind of doubt over the fact that these authorities were truly the bad guys. And we see similar kind of similar stories are told, Star Wars, Empire Rebels, Lord of the Rings, which is one of my favorite kind of examples, sort of of like metaphors for today's world with regards to kind of like the industrialized evil of kind of oppression and ruling people, even like the One Ring who rule them all kind of thing. And then the idea that those that are fighting against them are the free peoples of the world, and stuff like that. So I don't know how familiar you are with that story, but it's another thing where I
Star
kind of
Wars, yes.
Star Wars, yes. Lord of the Rings, not so much.
Everybody goes to the Star Wars movie and cheers for the rebels. Then they leave the theater and they cheer for the Empire.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. But I don't know. I feel like a lot of it is um, we. A lot of it just comes from um, people. It's hard to imagine change. It's hard to imagine like a new world. It's hard to imagine like a paradigm shift that's different from what you've always known and from what your parents have always known and your parents have always known and stuff like that. And I think the kind of the statism in people to the degree that it's there is really kind of beaten in generation after generation after generation. And I think that's why it's such a challenge to kind of liberate that from people. But I still feel like the spark of that is still within people, because apart from the fact that we all operate, maybe we don't all operate with the golden rule, and we're not all Christians, but not that we have to be to operate with the golden rule, but most of us, those of us who aren't overt criminals, operate with the non-aggression principle, at least person to person. We have many of us have the disconnect when it comes to government, but with regards to how we treat each other, we're not imposing authoritarianism, taking their money to pay for whatever. We're not doing any of those things on a personal level.
Right.
And I just feel like there's a kind of mind trick or spell that a lot of people are under, where they don't even see, there's like a disconnect in their mind with regards to moral behavior. And then when you branch it out to, on a societal level and governments and all the things, I think part of that is just because it's all they've ever known. The whole thing about, we can say taxation is theft, but a far more well-known phrase with regards to taxation is that and death are the only two certain things in life. You know what I mean? And I always find that such a kind of a horrible kind of saying, in the sense that, really, those are the two things of life that we can be just take to the bank and be certain of, is that we're going to get robbed and then we're going to die. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's not exactly invigorating thought, but at the same time, it also shows how embedded something like taxation. I mean, it's even in the Bible. Correct me if I'm wrong. And again, I'm not a scholar on it, but the nativity story, as we were always told, was the reason why they had to travel to Bethlehem is because they had to pay their taxes or register for taxes or something along those lines. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it was a census. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So they're traveling because for some government paperwork. It's government bureaucracy. That's why they have to make this rather risky trip. I mean, it's not like, you just hop in the car or something and drive to the hospital. It's, no, you're pregnant and you're riding on a donkey. You're outside all the time. Yeah. So, yeah, it's government paperwork. Yep. And I like how you brought in the, two certainties in life, death and taxes, that we've all heard. And I think that does, as you're saying, point to just the acceptance people have of these structures that they see in society. And I wonder if people just can't imagine that anything could be different than that, or that they don't want to. It goes back to what you said about security and safety. I think it's I did an article. I didn't, this wasn't really explicitly said in the book, but as I've continued the conversation on Substack, I did an article called Liberty in Human Nature, because I've being in the anarchist voluntarist space, I hear so many people tell me, like, oh, of course people want to be free. It's in our nature to be free. And I would say, I don't think it is. Have you met people? Have you observed people at all? Like, have you observed your own life, like, before you got to this point where you matured? Like, do you know, did you observe the COVID fiasco? How many do you think freedom is really the deep core of human nature? And I wrote, I don't think so. The deep core of human nature is the tension of emergent consciousness within a limited being. That's our nature. And while that makes liberty possible, it also makes anti-liberty very, very attractive. That's what you're talking about, the safety, because once you get the spark of consciousness, which we humans have, now you get to deal with possibility. And as wonderful as possibility can be, possibility means lack of certainty. So our deep core of human nature is that we realize uncertainty. We realize, like you're saying, things could change. Things could change. I just got used to this, and it could change. It could be different. So there's something deeply in our human nature that makes liberty possible, but it takes a lot of work, because that deep human nature also makes the slave mentality very, very useful, very attractive, and it allows us to offload a lot of the effort and energy. One thing about just doing what you're told is you don't have to waste energy, mental energy, deciding how to act. You just do what you're told. Isn't that easy? I don't have to waste time on this. I don't have to rack my brain over it. I don't have to put the burden on my own conscience, although deep down it'll still be there. But I can pretend that I did the right thing just because somebody else made the decision and I did what I was told, which I think I was supposed to. So I think there's something about human nature that a lot of us anarchists and voluntarists haven't properly dealt with, because we just assume that because we've gotten to the point, we have the kinds of personalities that are maybe lower in agreeableness, higher in openness, lower in neuroticism, perhaps more tolerant of risk. So because we've gotten there, we assume that, oh, that must be in everybody. No, it's not. I had this conversation with somebody about the writings of Lysander Spooner, who was a contemporary of people like Karl Marx and Thomas Malthus. But he was writing over here in the US rather than in Europe. And Spooner, he gets economics way better than they do, because he understands liberty a little more. But even he, in his writings, he assumed that if we could somehow simply get rid of government, that everybody would be so entrepreneurial and so successful. And no, because he was that way. He had a high tolerance for risk. He was an idea guy. He had that. But just because you get rid of government doesn't mean everybody suddenly becomes risk averse and has a high time preference and suddenly has the personality where they're generating all these ideas and they're good enough at math where they can run their own business, right? And understand resource inputs and resource outputs. And I don't think that happens. And so one of the big things I try to do in my Substack and in the book is I try not to assert that only one personality type is the good personality type. You can be a good neighbor and be a wonderfully creative entrepreneur. You can be a good neighbor and be not an idea person at all, but you understand how to treat the person next to you as a peer. You understand serving. You understand the word you brought up, reciprocity. You understand all of these things. And you also understand that this takes work. Like you are fighting against something deep in your primitive human psyche in order to recognize human dignity and behave in a way that respects natural human rights. That is not a given in human nature. And I think too many anarchists and voluntarists skip over all of that, and then we scratch our heads and say, why don't people want to be free?
Yeah. I think another trap that anarchists fall into a little bit is because we're kind of individualists, at least from a rights point of view. I feel like too many of us feel like we have to be kind of individualistic in every other element outside of rights. In regards, like you say, we forget that no man is an island, that we forget that people are different, and there's different things that we can bring to the table. You know what I mean? And even, to be honest, and I don't know whether you'll agree with this, but like I feel like the kind of the sheep like people, for want of a better description, that do just kind of go along with whatever. I feel like a lot of them would just as easily go along with a free society as they do with a statist society, simply because of that, not for the right reasons necessarily. A little bit like we talk about the good citizen. They could be a good citizen in a truly free society, and then that would kind of shift things a little bit, because it's a little bit like, I use the example, I mean, I use this example with a lot of things in my project, but including, I've mentioned it in our conversations already, but I use the example of slavery with regards to before it was abolished and after it was abolished, because if you ask most people today whether slavery is wrong or right, post abolition, when it's now recognized as being criminal and all the rest of it, 99.9% of people are going to say, of course, it was wrong. It's good that it's no longer allowed and all that sort of stuff. But prior to that, when slavery was like, all people ever knew, and the idea of abolishing it probably would just be fantasy to most people back then, a lot of those same people, the people that we might characterize as the kind of sheep-like people that are just going on whatever, would say, no, slavery is perfectly good. It's legitimate. It's because it's all they ever known, and that kind of again cries back to this good neighbor, bad citizen distinction, because in those situations, like I say, back in the days when slavery was a legitimate thing all across the world, and no one ever thought of considering it to be a crime, most people, apart from very, very outlying people, but once they did kind of get to that tipping point where things then did turn, the sheep were quite happy to flock over to that position and be like, oh yeah, cool, slavery's wrong. It's and also treat it, like I say, most people, not only do they agree that slavery's wrong, but they treat that as a of course, kind of course, as if for thousands and thousands of years most of the human race were pro-slavery, but they say, well, of course that's wrong, as if, so yeah, I just find that funny. But I mean, I don't know whether that's a hopeful thought or a depressing thought, because you can kind of take it each way. The hopeful thought is we could still move the sheep over to a free society, but the depressing side of that is perhaps not because they would all have their individual awakenings, but just because they're following along with whatever the status quo is. And although but even with that though, I think back in the sheep-like person back in the days of slavery that would have supported it because they're going along with it, I feel like there may have been some kind of tinged conflict within them, some kind of conscience speaking to them, some kind of sense of right or wrong, something, where things aren't resonating well, and perhaps they're not identifying it intellectually, but there's a kind of misery within them because of the way in which they're, essentially siding with evil. And whereas today, those same sheep who may not have done all the work and are just kind of lazily saying, yes, of course it's wrong, but they are also saying that with a kind of resonance. Like, maybe they're not thinking about it much more than the surface level, but there is of course, that resonates deep within them, that kind of marries up with the conscience that's inside. I don't know if I'm being a little bit too optimistic about the nature of people, but I just feel like, and like I said, I'm not even a religious person, but I almost feel like there's a kind of soul within people that we can kind of get to. And even those that are very sheep-like, there's still, truth still resonates with them. They might be easily fooled, and maybe their alarm bells that tell them this is wrong don't ring very loudly, which is why they are so easily fooled. But I still feel like they're there. You know what I mean? And when you can get them on, if you can get them onto a good society and being a good neighbor and a good citizen, to use your book's metaphor, I feel like even they would resonate in a way that, like, where there's an agreement that's different to the agreement they had with the bad world. Does that make sense?
Yes, I want to get back to the thing you said about the surface level, but I think there's a lot of people out there who, if it could be demonstrated to them would be able to say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll behave this way." Um, that's why I think the power of example is so important. It's why I described, like, right at the beginning. The opening sentence of the book is Jesus Christ, known as the second person of the Trinity. That would be in Christian parlance. But Jesus Christ, known as the second person of the Trinity, is God leading by example. The the Gospels, as they are written, are not just a bunch of decrees that Jesus said. The Gospels are descriptions of Jesus interacting with people and providing an example. So it's not the appeal to authority fallacy. Even though, if you're a believing Christian, this is the one person in history who could have actually made the appeal to authority argument. You're like, hey, I'm God. And yet, if you see him, if you read the Gospels and really immerse yourself in what's being recorded there, it's not Jesus doing the, hey, I'm God, you do what I say. It's Jesus taking on the human nature and demonstrating for people. And that's what draws people. Not the fact that he gave them a dictate, not the fact that he gave them first an elaborate philosophy or some set of principles. It's that first he demonstrated it to them. And so there's a lot of people who, when they see the evidence of demonstration, might be influenced. You know, you brought it up earlier that maybe people just can't imagine a better way. Well, yeah, if you have evidence in front of you of a society, and then someone is saying, well, but what about this? And there's no evidence plainly for them to interact with and see and sense, then they're going to go with with what they can see and sense and interact. So I think part of the challenge for any of us who want to have more voluntary-based interactions in the world is we have to demonstrate that. We have to, in tiny little ways, keep providing evidence. And, as that evidence piles up, now we have more to point to. And you should always be able to start with yourself with how you treat others. The other thing you said about surface level, I think that's a big problem, because the reason why people will say, of course, slavery is wrong, is because they've been told that slavery is wrong. But what they don't realize is that slavery hasn't been abolished. They simply started using a different term, and they changed from slavery being an ethnic status within society, because slaves weren't my people. Slaves are when we conquered somebody else from a different tribe. Instead of killing them all, we put them to work. So that was it. It was that people outside of the dominant ethnic group, the dominant social status, did not have that same opportunity in life. So you couldn't maybe own property. You had to work for somebody else, and you had to take what they gave you. The worker housing on the plantation. So we've stopped using the term slavery, but the idea that some people are beholden to someone else to produce at somebody else's command, well, that hasn't been abolished at all. It's still here. It's all over the place. But you've got to get past the surface level in order to identify it and to realize it. So I don't think, I think, you and I can avoid something and make a commitment to each other and to the people around us. Like, when I encounter somebody, I'm going to deal with them person to person, consent. But that's not how most people go through life. Most people go through life knowing that there's some sort of overlord somewhere that gets to tell you what to do. If the cop stops you, you better stand still and answer every question. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Even if it's a ridiculous stop for no reason. And if they want to come into your house and knock on your door, you better open the door. Because if you don't, they're going to break it down. I read something a long time ago. It was from a law professor who said that every law carries with it the death penalty. It's like, what do you mean every law carries with it the death penalty? Try not following the law and then having somebody say, no, you better do this. And then you say, no, I'm not going to do it. That's going to escalate. And at some point, you're going to be shot and killed. Every law carries with it the death penalty. So I would like people, it's a short book that I wrote, but I hope it's not a surface level book. I hope it's short because it's a manageable portion size. But I hope there's some depth to it because I want people to explore in their own lives, as I have in mind, and I encourage people to do that, beyond the surface level of the terminology you're familiar with, beyond the messaging you get that's clearly manipulative, towards delving deeply and trying to figure out for yourself what in your life, what in your being can align with certain things. What things do you have to fix? Well, I don't want to be pointed that way. I want to be pointed this way instead. Okay, well, what do you have to do to accomplish that? What help do you have to ask for if you need help? How do you identify good influence from bad influence from the people who say, oh yeah, I'll help you, but they're really not going to? You know, that's every political campaign we have in democracies where people are elected. It's the party out of power that says, oh, I'll help you fix that. And then they don't. Right. So the two things you were talking about there, especially the part about getting below the surface, I think that's so important. I don't think you can really be a good neighbor if you have not insourced ethics. You can't do it. You can LARP as a good neighbor. You can do cosplay as a good neighbor, but you can't really be a good neighbor if you haven't done the work of insourcing your ethics. Was any of that too weird?
No, that was great. That was an excellent summary, and just to kind of add to it, I you know, as I say, I do recommend people check this book out because it's, like I say, it's a remarkably easy read, and not because it's surface level. It makes a deep point, but it makes it concisely, and it takes you on a journey that's very easy to just kind of go along. You know what I mean? It's not a daunting journey. It's not a journey of, well, what the hell is he talking about? You can follow it. It's nice and simple. But no, it makes a very deep point and it resonates nicely. And I highly recommend people check it out.
Thank you.
Like I say, I will put links in the description for it. I feel like, and I don't know how, I forgot to ask you before we started this, how long you can actually talk for.
I could talk for a little longer. Sure. Go ahead. No time restriction.
Okay. And well,
lay it on me. Here we go.
Okay. Right. Well,
more questions, more stuff.
This is where it's all going to take a nosedive now. Well, I thought, especially as we touched on the slavery example, I thought that would be a good kind of segue over to the conversation we've already been having about the Nations of Sanity project. Okay. And I'll sort of start off with agreeing with you about the fact that slavery hasn't been abolished. And one of the things I kind of like to say is it's just kind of been rebranded. We essentially like free range slavery, you know, like you get your free range eggs as opposed to the battery farms. And it's kind of like the same thing. And the reason why I call it free range slavery is because there's still that ownership, which you spoke about, the government's claim over you and the threat behind every law that does have a death sentence, like you say, that at least escalating to, if it's not the immediate punishment, it's what would escalate to if you continue to resist, you know, up until the point, you know, it's comply or die is basically the you know, the ethos of the state agent. So you know, you're quite right. And as I say, the way I class it as kind of free range slavery is just by the fact that even though there's the ownership over us, we're free range in the regards that we're not told exactly what labor we have to do. We're free range. We can choose our own job, but the government still takes an ownership over, you know, everything we earn, everything we buy, everything we sell, own, you know, the lot, everything we want to pass on to our children. And even though they don't take 100% of it, I would argue they're claiming ownership, 100% ownership, by the fact that they're taking any percentage, a percentage that they're dictating, you know, by the way, and just leaving you a kind of personal allowance or whatever, to try to get by. So, you know, like, I fully agree with you. Obviously, the big part of the Nations of Sanity project is to kind of build on that point of saying we didn't abolish slavery, or at least we didn't do it properly. And my point, which I know you have some issues and disagreements with, which I want to go into, is to say, well, let's abolish slavery properly, and addressing the two ways in which I feel like we didn't do it correctly. One, which is the point you already made, where we didn't abolish it in the fullest sense because it's just this narrowly defined form of slavery, and the slavery that we might know as we might call statism continues. But the other way in which we did it wrong, or improperly, is by the fact that for the most part, and although there were peace treaties that were later kind of put in place for international law, but for the most part, slavery was abolished under the dictates of ruling authorities, which, by the same principles with which we oppose slavery, are essentially just slave owners, you know. So those are two obvious points, and I think we're both in full agreement on those elements of it. But I do know that you do take objection to the kind of idea about abolishing statism, as I would say. And I mean, basically, like the idea, just to kind of refresh people listening, the idea that the Nations of Sanity project presents is to say, let's make the non-aggression principle, the principle of individual self-ownership, let's make that the law, and let's do it through a peace agreement, because obviously through a ruling authority would contradict the principle. But if we have it as the terms of peace, then there's no kind of top-down, you're not allowed to do this thing because I say so. It's more just, you don't have the right to do this thing according to this principle. And as I say, and just kind of formalizing it, similar to how we abolish slavery in that formalized way. But like I say, but with those two differences, we do it fully to all forms of violations of your self-ownership, including statism and any NAP violating coercion, and we do it as the terms of a peace agreement. Like I said, I want to get really into the details of your scrutiny because I really appreciate you've already given me a lot, and I appreciate that. But I just wanted to kind of get down to you because I really want to. There's two things I really want to kind of pinpoint with regards to your disagreements, just so I can understand them fully. One is
that, by the way, that was a good encapsulation of what your position is. So I thank you for that, and everybody who's listening in right now, watching in, they can hear that foundation. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I wanted to make sure that everyone who isn't privy to the back and forth we've had on Substack, can be kind of caught up with regards to where we're coming from. But from my point of view, there seems to be two kind of areas I want to clarify with you. One seems to be more about the language, like, is abolition really a statist construct? But we could do something similar. If it's just the language, then I feel like you might still get behind this like idea with regards to the nuts and bolts of it, but terms like abolition you just don't feel are appropriate because of the statist connotations? Or is it, and it may be both, by the way, or is it not so much about the language, or it can also be about the language, but it's also about the nuts and bolts. It's also about the meaning underneath of it. It's also about the saying, you're not allowed to do this kind of thing, and we're going to use force to stop you. Regardless of whether you call that prohibiting or abolishing or establishing law or anything like that. Because my point is, I don't see I feel like we have a right to protect ourselves from, aggression. I feel like we have a right to protect each other. And if we do that in a kind of through a formalized agreement, through an establishment of a law that is, defensive by nature, and as I say, and established as the terms of peace, so there's no kind of authority invoked, I don't see the problem. So I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of help flesh out and perhaps give a bit of clarity, if you can, to those two issues. Like, is it just the language, or is it more than the language? I know the language is part of it, but is it also the nuts and bolts of what I'm proposing with regards to, this kind of enforcing this principle?
It might be a little of both. Voluntary contracts. And this is something that may be a cultural thing between us. In the U.S., people keep telling us that, oh yes, our government is good because there's a social compact, there's a social contract that we're all part of, and they're like, well, I didn't sign anything, like I didn't consent to anything. So, in a true sense, a voluntary contract is really just an exchange between the parties involved in the contract. And here's the bigger thing, which is the fallacy of government. You cannot put in a contract an exchange or an offer of something that you already don't possess. So, for instance, government survives based on the idea, and you brought this up very early, and it's a great distinction about how people wouldn't steal from each other person to person. but yet they would accept the government stealing from people. Okay, well, if you don't have the right to steal from someone else, how do you magically transfer that right to this institution to steal on your behalf? You never had that to begin with. So I don't think a contract does as much as perhaps you think a contract or a peace agreement would do. I think a true voluntary contract is only an exchange of real things that each person already has. Some sort of liberty property that each of us already has. And it would only really be binding to the two of us, not to anyone else that we encounter. It would also not enslave either one of us to the other. I mean, contracts are basically an agreement to exchange. So if one party can't meet their end of the bargain, it's not that the other party gets to enslave them and take it. It's that, okay, the deal's off. So I don't think true voluntary contracts are as overarching and binding as the way I read your description of it. And part of it is abolition and even prohibition. Voluntary contracts really don't abolish anything, and they don't prohibit anything. They simply set the terms of an exchange. And if the exchange isn't happening as both parties have agreed to it, then the arrangement is off and each party goes their separate ways. They don't get to now impose on the other. So I don't think abolition is something that a true voluntary contract can achieve. And I think setting that as the goal is at best a distraction, but at worst, it's a submission to the statist mindset that you're trying to redeem. And I'd rather not redeem the statist mindset because I don't think it's redeemable. You mentioned before that every institution like that is some level of evil. So I don't think the statist mindset is redeemable. I want a different mindset. That's what good neighbor, bad citizen is about. It's not redeeming citizenship. It's that there's another way that you should be interacting that sets aside that mindset and that set of goals to become neighborly. So I'm not against the Free Cities project. I think it's cool that it's happening, but they're not abolishing anything. It's basically a small scale agreement about property rights. Small communes that have taken place. My goodness, I'm forgetting the name of it. Bruderhofs. The Bruderhof communes that popped up in the US and even in Europe, started in Europe for a while. They're these little communes where people just agree to a way of life and they can do it. And it's wonderful, but they have no ability, nor would they have any right to impose it on everywhere else. So the fact that they've relinquished the most stringent private property claims within their community does not mean that they've abolished private property, nor that they've prohibited it. Because for two reasons. Number one, they can't enforce that at all outside of the individual members who've agreed to that. But secondly, they benefit from the fact that other people haven't done what they do. They create things in their commune that they then sell to the capitalists. And it's a wonderful symbiotic relationship. And if you can accept it for what it is, then you look at it and say, okay, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with it as a voluntarist, as an anarchist. But if I'm looking at it in terms of I need to strictly abolish one thing or the other, well, now I'm going to mess it up because voluntarism isn't a totalitarian system. And I think that's where people get tripped up. Socialism is totalitarian. You have to buy in or it doesn't work. Communism is totalitarianism. Fascism is totalitarian. Most deeply traditional religions, like Islam, is totalitarian. The old Judaism, Israelism, that's totalitarianism. Modern Zionism is totalitarian. Christianity, though, is not. And that's why I think Christianity and anarchism, voluntarism have a harmony. Christianity does not totalize. The same way anarchism doesn't totalize, voluntarism doesn't totalize, capitalism properly understood doesn't totalize. These things don't totalize. And if you try to totalize them, you destroy them. You start doing
What do
something
you
else.
mean
I got
by
into discussion
total?
with.
Sorry, didn't mean to
Go ahead.
interrupt you
Go
there.
ahead.
But what do you
Go
mean
ahead.
by totalize? Just sort of flesh that out, please.
The scope keeps scaling up. We talk about like government's too big, and a lot of people mean the size of government. I mean size and scope. Like the things that government is involved in is too much, no matter the size. I wrote an article called "The Fallacy of Local Control." I don't care if your miserable tyrant is your next door neighbor in your local community, your local level of government. Like that's bad too. So I think the scope, the idea that everything about your life would have to be subject to this ruling authority. That's a totalizing force. Voluntarism, properly understood, does not totalize. I got into a discussion at the bottom of one of my articles that was about capitalism, where I was taking apart how the word capital and capitalism is misused. And he was trying to argue to me that like he had a way of making voluntarism even more voluntary. I said, okay, give it a shot. And as he's describing it, it's about making it more impositional. And I kept saying, well, voluntarism doesn't totalize. It has to be open-ended. It's like, well, but what about consequences? I say, okay, well, yeah, voluntarism doesn't ignore consequences. It simply does not insist upon current predictions coming true. Anarchism, voluntarism, these are capitalism, these are open-ended ways of acting in the world. And they are ways of acting in the world that, while connected, which is why they are systems, they do not necessarily have to be all-encompassing the way other systems of thought that are manifest have to be. And it's the same thing with properly understood Christian social dynamics. You say, well, it's something godly. God, the creator of the universe. How is that not a totalizing thing? It's not a totalizing thing on the neighbor level. It allows for the differences that people have and the fact that you shouldn't be able to impose and force everything into one person or one group of people's or the majority's vision of how things should proceed. It's more respectful of process rather than forcing somebody's favored result. So I don't think voluntarism, anarchism, capitalism, and Christianity totalize well. And the problems we see in all of them come from somebody trying to totalize them. Like capitalism becomes just cronyism, or just goes all the way to fascism. Voluntarism goes all the way into weird cults where people aren't allowed to leave anymore. And so now you haven't made it more voluntary. You've taken away the voluntary. So I don't think, and I'm up to being convinced that it's possible, but I don't think that voluntary contract associations rise to the level of being able to abolish and truly prohibit anything. And I think that's a good thing, because if you had that ability and capacity to totalize, I think you wouldn't be talking about true voluntarism anymore and true anarchist consent-based ways of being. So I stop at a totalizing society because I realize the totalizing society suddenly upends all the good things that you thought you were aiming for. Now, maybe that's not a fair characterization of your specific project, but it is a criticism I have of, in general, people taking what could be a good idea and what I think is a good idea and just corrupting it because they want it to totalize. They want it to get to the level of, hooray, we've abolished fill in the blank, thing that we don't like. And I don't think it gets there. And if you do get there, you're not doing the thing that you set out to do originally. And I say you as the generic you, not you specifically. So
yeah.
What I just said relates to in some way your Nations of Sanity project, and what is adjacent to it, what is a good criticism, whether it's good or bad, qualitatively, and what is like outside of the scope of what you're trying to do.
Well, I mean, no, this is great for me because it's interesting feedback, because it helps me understand the perception of what I'm presenting, as well as like I say, the substantive objections. I mean, just to put a little bit of clarity onto the peace agreement element, because
Mhm.
I do want to clarify, because you're right that when people enter into an agreement, like me and you enter into an agreement, and we have terms to our agreement and all the rest of it, these are terms between us. It doesn't affect anybody else because they're not part of our agreement, you know. So I totally get that. And just to put a clarifier on this, and fun enough, just to give a shout out to an objection I had from Larkin Rose, who's not a fan of this at all. He basically said this is statist. Not exactly the same arguments you gave, but he basically kind of made kind of similar arguments in the sense of saying, well, look, the non-aggression principle isn't valid just because you make it law or establish it or whatever. And I agree 100% with that. And I agree with what you said about contracts. But my point is the purpose of the peace agreement isn't to legitimize the non-aggression principle. Like the moral principle of individual self-ownership is valid regardless of what the law is, you know. And this slightly comes back to this good neighbor, bad citizen point, you know, that we you know, this theme kind of runs through what we're talking about here, because, you know, in the situation of saying, you know, slavery is wrong. But like I say, prior to it being abolished, that didn't mean anything to the slaves in a practical sense. But whether or not the world considered them slaves or property or whatever, we know as anarchists who understand this principle of self-ownership that the moral truth of it was that they were self-owning individuals that were treated as slaves. They weren't actually slaves in a real sense. I mean, they were slaves in, you know, that they were treated that way, but in a truly moral sense, they were self-owning people, and that's why it was such a crime that they were treated as slaves and enslaved in the way they were. So I do want to kind of clarify that, because I'm not saying let's establish this peace agreement because that's what would then morally abolish or morally prohibit, you know, these things. And in fact, just a quick question to you before I continue: would you agree or not that the non-aggression, forget about the law aspect of it and enforcing all that, but would you agree that the non-aggression principle as a principle does prohibit these various things that violate the principle? Would you or would you not like the word prohibit? But, you know, like the non-aggression principle is the don't aggress principle, you know what I mean? So surely that means that principle is saying you're not allowed to do these things, whether prohibit's the right word or not. Or would you use prohibit? Or
it defines certain behaviors as acceptable and defines other behaviors as not acceptable, like thou shalt not steal. In a sense, that's a non-aggression principle. It's telling you what not to do, and it's defining that if you do it, that's a violation of something. So the non-aggression principle, I think, is a good guide. I think you brought up the golden rule. I've heard of something called the silver rule, which is basically the non-aggression principle, where the golden rule is various forms of it from different traditions is treat others the way you would want to be treated. The silver rule is don't treat people ways that you don't want to be treated. So that's the silver rule. That's basically the non-aggression principle. The next question would be like, okay, well, what's aggression? Like, if you're prohibiting aggression, then how much is aggression? And like, is there a clear line where aggression happens, or is this something negotiated? Because the other thing I like about voluntarism, anarchism, and even Christian neighborliness and capitalism is that it recognizes that almost all of our interactions will be a negotiation. Because if you don't want slaves and masters, and that doesn't mean that one person's always a slave and one person's always the master. If you don't want that dynamic, then you must accept negotiation. So that's the other reason why I don't think that a non-aggression, like I would agree that the non-aggression principle lays out properly things that should not be done and gives you a reason why. Like, it's trying to say aggression is wrong, and so this is right, why this is wrong, because it aggresses on something else that isn't there. I would go deeper than a non-aggression principle down to natural human rights, because while most people think the rights to life, liberty, and property, they call them negative rights because they just tell you what you're not supposed to take from others. I think that's a really bad description of it, and it leads to a lot of problems. Natural human rights are based on positive assertions about human beings. And a right, very shortly as a definition, is a valid claim. So the reason why you have a right to life is because you have a better prior claim to your life than someone else would. The reason why you have a right to liberty is because you have a better prior claim to your intentional action in the world than someone else does. The reason why you have a right to property is because if you have truly cultivated something or duly traded for it with someone else, then you have a better prior claim, what we might call a title, to that property than someone else would. So they all function at the level of positive morality before you can create the, okay, here's the border, and now the other side of that border is the other side of that boundary, the other side of that defining line is the negation. So the non-aggression principle is a good principle, but I think it's by definition giving you a landscape in which you negotiate rather than giving you a landscape in which you know ahead of time all the things that are absolutely prohibited.
Okay, yeah.
Like walking through somebody's yard, somebody owns a big field of land, and you cut through a corner of it to go someone else. How much of that is aggression versus like kicking down the door of their dwelling and walking through their house? Like there's a difference there. And some people always say, no, if you cut through the land, well, there's no fence here. It's just nature. It's a big open property. It's uncultivated. No, but they still have the thing, and somebody drew it out, and they can show you a piece of paper that says they have title to it, and you should like know that, and you should walk completely around it. Anyways, like, but I'm not bothering anybody. I'm not really hurting anybody. I'm not even hurting the land. Like animals trudge through this more often than I do. I'm just cutting through here. I didn't even know that this guy had owned this land because there's no indication of it anywhere that anybody cultivates this. So it brings you into a setting where you negotiate almost as a rule. Like your rule isn't slave master. Your rule is we're going to negotiate.
Yes, but you still have terms for that negotiation, like which you
Yes.
kind of alluded to. It's not slave master slave. It's
Yep.
equal person, or equal self-owning person, equal self-owning person. And I feel like the non-aggression principle almost deals primarily with authority or rights, but it's rights and responsibility. I mean, that's why I feel like self-ownership is the best way to kind of really clarify what you're talking about when you say what's aggression. I mean, aggression is quite a vague term on its own,
Right.
divorced from the this principle.
Yeah.
But when we ground it, and in fact, even how I present this idea, I used to present it as let's make the nap the law. And apart from the fact that a lot of people don't know what the nap is, the other reason why I changed my wording was because I thought, well, even if they know what it is, I want to emphasize self-ownership. I want to emphasize what we mean when we say non-aggression principle, because as you say, aggression can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But if we ground it on what we're actually talking about, individual self-ownership, this concept that everybody has authority, right, ownership, responsibility over only themselves, and that's why I think ownership is a good word, because it kind of encapsulates both the right and the responsibility. You know what I mean? Like if you
Yes.
own your car, you have right over your car, but you're also responsible. If your
Yes.
car kills somebody because you left the handbrake off and it ran over someone or whatever, you're responsible for that. You own yourself, which means you have the right to govern your actions, but you're also responsible for your actions and accountable
Yes.
for them and all the rest of
Yes.
it. So I feel like that's why that's an important point to kind of ground that in.
Agreed 100%. Yes. I try to make the same point a lot. Yes.
Well, and also, I mean, I know there's so much that we do agree on, which is another reason why I'm so fascinated to explore the areas, because I feel like it's that kind of iron sharpens iron kind of ethos of, I feel like the more we can kind of pick holes in each other, it really does a favor. I mean, I remember when I had a conversation with Adam Heyman about this, he kind of started it off by saying, well, I don't want to tear anything down, but I've got, this concern and that concern. And I was like, it's not tearing down. It's, for me, this is valuable scrutiny. This is sharpening. This is refining. This is sanding. This is poking holes. I want to see where the holes are. So, like I say, I invite, encourage, and appreciate all of this, pushback that you're giving. But one of the things I kind of want to put to you is like when you say about how the non-aggression principle says, you're not allowed to steal. Like, would I be, in what way would I be out of line to say, well, it's abolishing stealing or it's prohibiting stealing? Like, because I really want to sort of narrow down onto your disagreements so I can understand them properly. Like, if any of them are misaligned, then I can like realign them. Oh, actually, you don't disagree. It's just a word choice, or or if you do, to understand that disagreement so I can kind of really examine it myself. So, like, if I was to say, okay, you say the non-aggression principle says we're not allowed to steal, I'm saying it prohibits stealing. And then is it so far to say, well, let's abolish stealing? You know what I mean? Like where's the objection coming in and why at the different points there?
Because the non-aggression principle carries no necessary way to enforce it. You can enforce it, but it carries with it no necessary enforcement. Like if someone steals from you, you could say, you know what, it's not worth the trouble, and maybe that guy needs it more than me. So that a principle is a philosophical grounding in which you anchor your behavior. But a principle is not necessarily an enforcement. It's like what you brought up with slavery and how people were treated. The fact that slaves, as a principle, have ownership over themselves does not mean that that was enforced in any way. So when you leap from principle for behavior and then make the small leap into a contract between individuals who can consent to agree, but then you leap to our agreement now fixes the future so that this thing no longer happens, it's going to happen. Or at least you would accept the possibility that it does. That's why a contract doesn't actually enforce a future imposition. What a contract does is set the terms of an exchange, and as long as each party keeps abiding by it, then you've basically done the overhead work of already laying out the exchange. And as long as you keep agreeing to it, you don't have to keep signing a new contract every day. I mean, imagine if somebody renting warehouse space had to show up the first day and say, hey, I'd like to rent some warehouse space. I have a bunch of stuff. I run a business. I need some space to keep my wares. And the owner of the warehouse says, sure, I'll rent it to you. And then that guy loads all the stuff in. At the end of the day, says, okay, well, I got to get it out of here and come back tomorrow and sign another one-day contract. The purpose of the contract is to say this is an exchange whose terms we would like to continue without having to go through all of the overhead of negotiating every single instance of it. So as a statement of this is what I believe and this is what I intend to do, it's fine. But law in the government sense is not only concerned with what people intend to do. It's concerned with enforcing a future. That's why government is archetypally evil. Because government, to justify government is to not only excuse evil that has already happened and evil that's happening now, it's to write a blank check to excuse the evil that will happen in the future. And so I would, and there are some contracts that can be written that way. That's why I keep saying a truly voluntary contract, I don't think would rise to the level of abolishing anything. A principle and an initial agreement is a starting point where you declare This is how I intend to act. And then it's up to you to demonstrate that. And if you don't demonstrate it, then the other person doesn't get to impose on you. The other person then says, well, then we agreed to this. I no longer have to give you this. Like if the warehouse owner suddenly locked the doors on you, even though you signed a 5-year lease and you got 4 years left on it, and there was no valid reason why they did it, you hadn't broken the contract, and then said to you, well, you still owe me for it because you signed a contract that said you were going to pay me for 5 years. It's like, well, but you took away the thing that we agreed to exchange. So no, now I don't owe you for the next rest of the 5 years. Our agreement is off. Now, on the other hand, that doesn't mean that the person who rented the warehouse space can now just destroy the warehouse. Now, if the warehouse renter's property is still in there, yes, you'd be able to strike a deal and say, hey, I need to get my stuff, and you get your stuff, but you don't get to then like impose on the warehouse owner, destroy his stuff, extract something else from it. It's just say like, hey man, it didn't work out. Sorry. So I think there's much more negotiation and much less trying to enforce the future in a truly voluntary contract than perhaps, and maybe it's just because you haven't fleshed it out yet to me, but like you have it all planned out and you've already fleshed it out and I just haven't heard it yet. But maybe that's what Larkin Rose was getting at with you. The not being privy to his conversation with you. You know, if he's saying that, yeah, this looks like statism, maybe he was pointing to the idea that you're when you say abolish, you're talking about the future. And you're declaring that you've already set the terms of the future reality. And I don't think that's a voluntary position. I don't think that's an anarchistic position. And if you actually got to that point, you would now be flipping anarchism and voluntarism into something that they're not. So maybe it's the same. Maybe it's not only a problem with the language, but it's because perhaps Larkin, myself, Adam Heyman, other people who've heard it, perhaps it's because we know that there are things tied to that terminology that we know are going in the wrong direction. Like abolition sounds to me like it's the wrong direction.
Okay.
Because you
Cool. Sorry. No, this is great. I understand what you're saying. I suppose from my perspective, and just to go back to the peace agreement kind of example. So imagine you're person A, I'm person B, and there's a hypothetical person C who's, let's just say, a rapist. Okay, so me and you are good people. We're anarchists, we're libertarians, we understand self-ownership and all the rest of it. So you person A and me person B, we agree to have this peace agreement where we say, do you know what, we agree that self-ownership defines crime. It defines our rights and freedom and objectively gives us like an objective law of, you know, just behavior. And again, let's just assume that you agree with me on this, and we agree that the non-aggression principle is justifiably enforceable as law. Indeed, it's the only principle that would be justifiably enforceable because it's defensive and all this. So we have our little peace agreement. Now, our peace agreement is just between us. So you're quite right when you point out that the contract is between A and B, and it's got nothing to do with C. But this is where the devil in the detail of what I'm saying is, because I'm not saying that C isn't allowed to rape because we've made this agreement. Yes. I'm saying that us making this agreement might make us more effective at stopping him because we've got this formalized understanding, like with the abolition of slavery made it more easy to kind of overthrow slavers and free slaves and all the rest of it. What my point is the reason why C is not allowed to rape existed long before we even decided to have our little agreement between ourselves. The reason he's not allowed to rape is because, objectively speaking, he does not have the right to do it. Like he could not make a coherent claim that he has that right, because and I don't want to kind of get too deep in the philosophical aspects of it, but I'm sure you're familiar with the is-ought gap, like the Hume's guillotine. Yeah, like, you know, you can't get an ought from an is, and you know, they say, well, we can't get morality from basic facts. We need a presupposition. We need to kind of presuppose that we want morality before we can kind of go down that road. And I agree with that. But I would say, okay, well, in that case, like, and this is, I think, a little bit why maybe people talk in negative rights rather than thinking of as a kind of positive thing, because rather than saying we have the rights, I think what we can say more definitively and with more kind of objective grounding is that person C doesn't have the right to rape. Because if I say I have the right, somebody who just doesn't believe in morality at all can say, well, I don't believe in rights. I don't believe there's any such thing as morality. And because of the is-or gap, I can't objectively tell him he's wrong. But once he invokes morality, once he invokes the concept of rights, then he's subject to some kind of logical framework that goes from that. And my argument is basically that because rights doesn't work without self-ownership, like you can't coherently claim the right to rape somebody else because there's no grounding behind that. Like you're either accepting rights, in which case self-ownership, you don't have right over other people, you only have right over yourself, and the same for them, or you reject rights altogether, in which case you can't make any kind of rights claim, including the right to rape. So there's kind of an undeniability behind saying C doesn't have the right to rape. He cannot coherently make that rights claim. So I guess what I'm saying in a bit of a long-winded way is that the principle has, perhaps abolished isn't the right word, but I feel like prohibited is close enough to be kind of what I'm talking about. I feel like the principle has already prohibited C from rape, long before we ever had our little peace agreement. And what the peace agreement between us is about just agreeing that this is a crime that he's committing, and that we agree that that he doesn't have the right to do it, and everybody else has the right to stop him from doing it, and that force would be justifiable. Now, whether or not you agree with that, I'm just making the point as to that's what I'm talking about. This peace agreement is about. It's not about giving legitimacy to the non-aggression principle or the concept of self-ownership. Like I say, the slave was a self-owning individual long before slavery was abolished, but he wasn't treated that way. And I'm just saying that me and you as person A and B having our little peace agreement, we're just agreeing to formalize that, like what is and isn't allowable behavior with regards to this concept of rights that we understand. And we're saying that whether or not C is part of our agreement doesn't really matter, because regardless of our agreement, he doesn't have the right, and regardless, he doesn't have the right to rape, and regardless of our agreement, we have the right to use force to stop him if he tries or if he, succeeds, and as long as it's proportional and relational to that crime, we don't have the right to then do other things. But like I feel like the principle implies the prohibition. You know what I mean? Like it sets the limits of what you are allowed to do. It says you can do what you want. In fact, there was one line I remember from your various responses to me that kind of really stuck in my head when you said, and forgive me if I'm butchering this, it's obviously not going to be word for word, but you said something along the lines of, when it comes to people exercising their natural human rights, there is no prohibition or there is no abolition. I forgot which you used, but that's the basic sentiment. Am I characterizing that accurately?
Correct.
But sorry, go on.
Remember that a right is only a valid claim. So you and I, because we assert natural human rights, have a different framework for what we consider valid and invalid than other people might. For a long time, there was a right to do a lot of things that you and I find distasteful because it was a valid claim. Might makes right is a reality for most of human history. It's like, well, what is the valid claim that I have? Well, can you do it? I can. Well, then you have a right. I can claim this territory because I can kick out anybody else that's here. I have a valid claim. Well, it's an invalid claim. Says who? Unless it's the other person that's going to come in and now conquer you on that framework. So the is ought thing, I don't know that I know it's a very famous saying by David Hume. I don't know that it's actually true in observable reality. I know that some people want it to be true. I've also heard people invoke it. I'm not saying you've done this. I've seen pundits on TV invoke it in very peculiar ways, like only when it suits their purposes, you know. So I don't know how true that is observably. And the way you were describing it, it doesn't sound like you're adhering to it either. You're searching for an is that provides the foundation for an ought, as most people do. Like that's what morality is. It's like we're searching for a foundation in the real world that now tells us what to aim for and what not to aim for. So I think we all use some version of is to get to our oughts. I don't think any of us has an ought that is not grounded in at least our perception of reality. So I don't think,
Well,
while
sorry, go on,
well, I
please.
believe natural human rights to be universal, that doesn't mean that everybody else believes natural human rights to be universal. And I have no way of imposing that on them. The best I can do is express my beliefs in how I treat them, and perhaps negotiating with them, maybe having a conversation if, you know, they're not going to be the kind of person who hits first and asks questions later. Then I've got a shot to do that. But I don't think it's just practical or even desirable in social reality to have just a kind of like a hive mind, singular belief system that's just implanted in all of us that we can identify and say, oh, well, that person clearly is committing a crime. As we think so, yes, but as he thinks so or she thinks so, maybe not. And here's the stranger part. Perhaps not even as his or her victim thinks so. Like Stockholm syndrome is real. There's a lot of people who, it's so strange in modern Western society. There's a lot of people who claim to be victims of things when they're not victims of things because they have no claim to it. They just don't like what other people are doing. And then there's a lot of people who are quite frankly victims of things who insist that they're not. Like battered spouse syndrome. You know, people have been so traumatized that they no longer have the functional framework to express what's wrong and to do anything about it. Like, so I don't think it, you know, you and I having an agreement not to rape, not to steal, not to kill. It not only doesn't affect person C, now it may affect our ability to respond to something person C does, if we have the ability and the opportunity to do so. But if we do that, it's not the NAP that's doing that. It's you and I with the ability and the capacity in the moment to do it. And as you said quite correctly, proportional to what was threatened. You know, if someone wants to steal a pack of gum from you and like you know, torch his car, I mean, that's not proportional, you know. So it's not the principle that does it. It's the people who have the ability and capacity and the well-developed maturity to do it properly who can do it. And yet that still only applies in the moment when an offense is happening. Like I can't say to somebody like, you know, 10 years ago you did something to me and now I'm claiming my my just recompense. It's like, well, at this point you're probably not. Like the time for defense was in the moment. And when the violation was happening and when it was evident enough to everybody that simply pushing back in the moment was sufficient to establish the facts. Like
Would you say that allowable force ends at that moment though, or would you still believe that there is allowable like responsive force as well, as or
sure, you
does
can
it
push
have to
back.
be? Yeah.
If you know you're walking down the street with your briefcase and some pickpocket comes over on a motorcycle and tries to grab your briefcase, are you justified in holding onto that briefcase and snatching it back from him? Of course you are. Yeah, you have a valid claim to that and it's in your possession, and there's nothing wrong with you stopping someone else from assuming it for themselves. Yeah. But
Well, the reason I ask is because I mean I have had even a debate with, there are some anarchists who believe that the non-aggression principle can only justifiably be enforced before the fact, and after the fact it's kind of too late, because it's too late to stop the, you're justified in stopping the aggression, but once it's
Yeah.
committed, it's kind of too late. Now I disagree with that for a number of reasons, not least of which the fact that it kind of feels like you're rewarding criminals for committing the crime successfully by saying, okay, we won't do nothing now because you've done it, you know what I mean, rather
Yeah.
than, so I don't think that's what you're saying, but obviously that's kind of a point I wanted to clarify with you, because
Sure. Yeah. You have the right to lock your door, but if someone breaks in through your door, you don't have to then let them, take whatever you have in there. It's like, well, I was only allowed to lock my door and that didn't work. So I guess I'm done now.
but it's like, like for example, if you saw like a rapist attempting to rape, there's no debate amongst anarchists over whether you have the right to use force to stop them, because they don't have the right to rape, so you're not infringing on them by stopping them or whatever. But my
Sure.
point is but yes, but if you got there too late, they just finished their rape and now they're walking away peacefully.
Mhm.
Some are saying, okay, well, now you can't do nothing to them because it's too late to stop them from the aggression, and now it's just revenge or whatever, and that's not
Mhm.
permitted within the non-aggression principle. No, I disagree with that, because I say that um, part of the prohibition against rape includes the entitlement to response, and as I say, I also feel like there's obviously a perverse incentive if we had a legal structure like that, where once you committed the crime, you're essentially got off scot-free because it's too late to stop you. And we're all like, okay, well, it's done now. I understand with stolen property, you can return it, but with a
Yep.
crime like murder and rape, you can't return that. You know what I mean? You can't
No.
undo that. You can't give that back or take that back or anything like
Yep.
that. So just like I said, I just want to clarify from your position, when you talk about like the allowable force with regards to before, but do you also accept that there's like a right of response as well?
I mean, anybody who's de-escalated a bar fight, and stopped it from getting out of hand is essentially doing what you're saying. You're in the moment and you're you're getting in between something that looks like it's going to get out of hand, and you're managing to do it. Now, um, how far you take that into the future, maybe you befriend some of the people, I don't know. Who had been the aggressors, and get them to change. A big old blockbuster movie story about the person with the heart of gold who got that other guy to change his life or whatever. I have been in situations where I've had to help somebody who looked like they were being either accosted or, I mean, I won't say, graphically, violently attacked, but, people who are accosted. And, sometimes it's just enough that another person is there and says, hey, what's going on, ma'am? Do you need help? Sir, do you need help? And that's just enough to, you know, and you get your body in between people if you can, if it looks like someone's coming after someone else and you have that capacity in you to do. Um, so, yes, you can exercise your rights to help someone else. Um, in your example of, let's say you get there too late and the crime has already been committed and the person is getting away. Well, if they're getting away with something that's obviously material and that you saw in yourself, now it's up to you to say, do I want to take the chance that I, yes, saw a crime and that I'm going to, in my mind, make it right? Because at that point, like ownership is rights and responsibilities. At that point, if I'm wrong, now I've committed the crime. And now we're back to, again, the negotiation and how do we stop this from becoming an endless chain of people declaring, well, the law is on my side and I can enforce it, and here and there. So that's why I think a lot of anarchists and voluntarists say your emphasis should be on preventing things that happened and not going after people you think are criminals, because it gets a lot messier when you get into let's let things happen. And also, I think that's a wonderful justification for why people should exercise personal responsibility in securing themselves and their loved ones and their possessions, because you don't want it to get to the point. If you can somehow discourage nonviolently people from getting to that point, if you can remove incentives, a great word that you used that I like to use a lot as someone who enjoys economics, if you can remove those, yes, do those. But I don't think so that's a long way of saying because you and I agree on a framework for valid claims, that doesn't mean that it's objectively true that everybody else agrees on it. You and I can make an agreement between each other, and even without agreeing with each other, I can make an objective morality for myself of how I'm going to treat others. And so it's objective in the sense that I'm going to apply it to everyone. But that doesn't mean it's objective in the sense that everyone else now is under that.
Sure, I understand, and I realise that, like, obviously, prevention is more effective than cure, and no one wants to be raped and just have the privilege of punishment afterwards. And
No.
there's already a lot of incentive to obviously stop crime before they occur. Um, but my point is because I suppose what the non-aggression principle is for me is drawing the lines around what defines our freedom and rights. Where we have the right to act and all the rest of it. So there may be better ways to do things, but my point is it within our rights to use after the fact force in response to non-aggression principles? Like I say, the thing is about robbing a thief getting away with material goods is you can still argue that you're still in a prevention mode. They've already robbed it, but you can take that back, so you're still preventing the theft long term. Whereas in the case of something that's not returnable, like a rape or a murder or some kind of vicious assault, then that you don't have that. But I would argue you still have the right for response. There's a number of reasons why, apart from the fact that you could argue that you're obviously this person's kind of proven themselves a danger to future people. So you could argue that there is a prevention for future crimes. But I would argue that even without that, you have this crime that they've already committed, to which there is a victim who I would say would have a higher authority over everybody else, over reprisals, if you like. So for example, if the victim wants to forgive, then everyone else would have to kind of accept that. But that's tied down to kind of self-ownership. Okay,
no, we don't.
Okay.
And I'll bring it back to the principle of a truly voluntary contract. If and this comes into reputation. Like if you see someone who's a thief, and for some reason the person they steal from forgives them, I can witness that and say, all right, well, that person doesn't mind being stolen from, but I do. And so now I'm going to remember that. And so now I'm not going to enter into agreements with that person. I'm going to keep my eye on them more. And this brings us back to voluntary contracts, where for you to exist in a society, unless you're going to be a thief who's constantly going from town to town and being anonymous at first, like if you intend to stay in a society long term, the incentive for you not to engage in aggression or anything that breaks the norms of the society is that the people there have the right to disassociate from you. The people there have the right to no longer enter into agreements with you for trade and exchange. If you find out that the warehouse owner, is a rapist, and you're like, I don't want to stay here and do business with this guy, I'm now afraid of him. It's like, buddy, our agreement's off. I'm packing my stuff and getting out of here. I'll send you the next month's rent. I'm gone. Or if you find out as an owner that you are now renting to somebody who's using it for terrible things, you could be like, that wasn't part of our agreement. I'm not going to charge you anymore, but you're out. So it gets back to truly voluntary agreements and contracts, where the proper response after the fact is to have reputational incentives, and to say, all right, well, I'm going to do my part not to give this criminal more opportunities. And not just opportunities to be a crime, but I'm going to keep my eye on that guy. I'm not going to trust him. I'm not going to shop at his store. If he tries to sell me something, I'm not going to buy it. I'm going to buy from someone else. So there are real consequences that happen if you're still in that voluntary transaction mode rather than the retribution mode. So I do wonder, and that is a good point of debate, is does the NAP, after you determine that something has happened, Does the NAP allow for retribution as consequence, or does the NAP only dictate that what happened now changes your future engagement with that person? Because if it's the second thing, then I agree that it's within the NAP. If it's the first thing, I'm not sure that the NAP as a principle would approve of retribution.
Well, perhaps not framed as retribution, perhaps reframed as perhaps response rather. But I, I suppose what I'm getting at is because I agree with you in the sense that yes, we have that option, and market forces can be a powerful thing in the way that reputational consequences and all of that sort of thing. Sure, but the problem is that applies to everything, whether or not it's a violation of the non-aggression principle, whether or not it's something you have a right to. I mean, like
so you don't need a new thing to handle bad behavior.
Well,
the same set of principles that handles favorable behavior could also guide you when you see unfavorable behavior. So you don't really need a new thing like that. That's a good insight.
Well, perhaps, but just to step away from what's the optimum way to do things, and then just to move into the realms of what we have the right to do, because that's what I really want to talk about is like where the non-aggression principle draws this line around where our rights begin and end. And my point is if there's let's say there's a hypothetical rapist, but let's also say there's a hypothetical racist. Okay. Now, as a self-owning individual, you have every right to be a racist. Express that opinion. I mean, depending on how you act, but you have a right to that opinion. And you have a right to be a prejudiced person, to discriminate in your own. Decide that you don't want to associate with people of whatever race or whatever. Whatever your thing is about. I have no right to use force to stop you from being a racist, because that's just an exercise of your natural self-ownership. I think you know where I'm going here. But the rapist, whether or not it's the optimum approach or whatever, but my point is I do have the right to use force against the rapist, because and this comes back to your sentence about there's no prohibition when people are exercising their universal rights. Is my point about non-aggression principle violations is that's not within our human rights. We don't have the right to rape. We don't have the right to murder. We don't have the right to do all these things, which is why force can be used against us if we commit those crimes, both to prevent them and in response to them, providing it's proportional, necessary, and related to prevention of the crime in that sense. I mean, just and we don't necessarily need to divert. So okay, well then, but that's kind of like my point about it is like the reason why I say that it's justifiable for us to enforce the Napper's law with our little peace agreement that makes no difference to whether or not person C has the right to rape. He doesn't, regardless of our peace agreement. And we have the right to stop him, regardless of our peace agreement. But by establishing our peace agreement, by formalizing this understanding that we know that this is a crime, and we will, perhaps we don't have to. I mean, again, one point you did make that I did want to agree with, but I kind of forgot to mention it, was you are quite right that the non-aggression principle does not provide an obligation to enforce it. But we do have the right to enforce it. That's my point. I'm saying we have the right to enforce the non-aggression principle. We have the right to enforce prohibitions against rape, murder, theft, and assault, and all these things, not because we have some special right to dictate to people, but simply because they don't have the right to do those things. And because they don't have the right to do those things, we're not infringing on their rights if we use force to enforce laws against those things. Does that kind of make sense?
No, I think you are, though. Like the rapist racist comparison is a good one, because the racist, someone who holds racist views, is not necessarily acting on them in ways that affect other people.
I've lost you. You've gone mute.
Check.
Yeah, you're back. You're back.
Okay. I may have touched the microphone just briefly there. So the racist is not necessarily usurping someone else's better prior claim to anything just by harboring a view. Whereas someone who commits a rape in the act of making the rape is usurping something like the bodily integrity of the other person. But here's why those two things are different in another way. The racist is a racist all the time. The rapist is not a rapist all the time. So if your encapsulation of the non-aggression principle holds that an act that someone commits becomes that person's identity, and now they may be treated as an isolated act they committed, I think that becomes a violation of the NAP. I wrote an article called Passive Poets and Empty Experts, and I used a quote from the poet Jane Hirschfield, who says, "I don't like to call myself a poet unless I'm actively writing a poem. I don't think it's an identity you rest in."
Okay.
And so I think the same thing, like a thief is only a thief when they're in the act of stealing. It may be a one-off thing, maybe it's a habit, but that's a distinction that you'd have to make. So, but to say that this person once stole something and now their identity is thief, and now based on that identity, because of an act that had a start and a finish, now into the future, their identity as thief remains. And now that identity that we've carried forward into the future now allows us, with a clear conscience, to treat them in ways that we normally would not be allowed to treat them. That's the problem with enforcement, and it goes back to the point about if your enforcement is about fixing a future consequence, and if the way you get there is by saying an act that a person commits becomes the person, and so now I'm justified in responding to an act by going after the person. The reason why defense is acceptable in the moment is because the act is taking place. And if you're trying to prevent the act, that's when you do it. If you're trying to prevent a future act, the way you do it is look at the present and be more careful about what you enter into the future. It's not by finding someone who did something you didn't like in the past and then identifying that person with everything in the future. It's a very static view of human beings that I don't think is accurate to humans. It allows for no sense of maturity. It allows for no sense of change. There's a lot of people who've done great things in the world who have some stupid thing they did in the past, where if that became their identity forever, and that allowed them to be treated by other people in ways that they wouldn't be treated. You know, when you change your behavior, it should be because you are now changing incentives, not because you've cast someone as you've cast a person as an act, and you're now going to respond to the person all the time as if the act is being presently entered into. So that's where the statism comes in, and the charges of statism comes in, because statism is about that. Remember, the good citizen mantra is about the imposed hierarchical social order. So it's about your social status. So a properly exercised free voluntary society is not about affixing status to people, because status is static. It doesn't move. It doesn't change. It doesn't grow. It's not alive. It's dead. If you want a living, lively society where people interact with each other properly, then your way of looking at violations and mitigating them can't be a status-based mitigation.
Yeah, no, I understand.
That's not growth, and that's not living, and that's not an alive society. So the problem with saying, what about the rapist, is now you're affixing a status to the person from the past. And I don't think that's enforceable as the NAP, the way self-defense in the moment is obviously enforceable in the moment. So I think that's the disconnect. And when you use a word like abolish, you're talking about a status that you're trying to carry forward in a sense. And so that's where my disagreement is with you, is that the attempt to staticize things also kills them. and I don't want to live in a dead society. I don't want to live in a dead, peaceful society. The cemetery is extremely peaceful.
Yeah, I
I
understand.
don't want to live in a cemetery.
Yeah, I get your
Right?
point.
That's the
Yeah,
mitigation. You and I have to get to a point where we can exist with each other as living beings, not as isolated statuses that can then be placed in different time slots and place slots.
yeah, I understand that.
And that may have been too weird, but
No, 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 that
have
may
at me with it.
no,
Have
no,
at me
no,
with it.
no. That made perfect sense, and I do understand the point you're getting at, and you make a lot of valid points within that point with regards to like people have the capacity to change, rehabilitation, reforming, and all the rest of it, and by kind of labeling someone as always this or that because of one act that they committed, yeah, I can see the issues with that, but I would push back a little bit when you say about like how a racist is always the racist is always a racist, whereas the rapist isn't always raping. But I would disagree with that a little bit in the sense that I mean, racists can change. There are people that used to
So, yeah,
be
sure.
KKK members and all the rest of
Yeah.
it. So there is still that capacity. But even before he's quote unquote changed and is still a racist, he's not, doesn't mean that 24/7 he's just thinking racist thoughts. There may be some times when he's not thinking a racist thought, but he
Sure.
is still quote unquote a racist because he has been and will likely be again the next time he fancies thinking about it or talking about it or whatever. He will continue to be a racist, and then only when he
Because
actually
it's a
does.
principle and an orientation. Racism
Yes,
is a
yeah.
principle and an orientation. Rape is not a principle and an orientation. It's an act that is actually evident.
But being a rapist, like being a racist, like just how the rapist isn't all just how the racist isn't always thinking racist thoughts to be a racist. The rapist doesn't have to be constantly raping to be a rapist. If they've raped and are likely to rape again because they haven't reformed or repented in any kind of way, they're still that same person, if you like. Then I still think that they are still a rapist, like just the same. Like I suppose
But
I
how would
dis.
you know?
Well, how would you know the racist is still a racist? Like I feel like the
I
same
don't. But
problem
the fact
exists
that
in
I'm not,
both.
I don't. But here's the great thing: I don't have to know because I'm not trying to enforce anything. Like to your point, if I hear somebody who says a racist thing, and then I always think that they must be saying that all the this is cancel culture, right? Somebody lets something slip out, or they find a tweet the guy made 10 years ago, or a woman made 10 years ago, and you say, oh well, they still have that same thought, we're going to sanction them. Well, if they're like, I don't have to enforce anything on someone else's opinion. I only have to enforce something on someone else's act. So do I know that someone who said a racist thing last week is still thinking that? No, I don't. But unless I'm trying to do something to them, it doesn't matter if I know what's in their mind.
But my point is, with regards to the racist, is the reason why, like, I don't have the right to act against the racist anyway. Like I can do all the things you mentioned before about, like the consequences with regards to reputation. I can have nothing to do with them. I can
Mm-hmm.
go my own way. I can lock my door. I can do all of those things with the
Sure.
racist, and I can do
Mm-hmm.
those with the rapist as well. But my point is that's because I don't have the right to do any more than that. I don't have the right to use force on the racist because the racist has
Right.
the right to be a racist. But my point
Yes.
is that the rapist doesn't have the right to be a rapist. He doesn't have the right to rape. So therefore, like, I do have the right to use force against the rapist. I
Sure.
understand the point you make about past crimes and reforming and not being that person anymore. But my point about the distinction between the racist and the rapist is the fact that the racist is just exercising his self-ownership. So I have no right to aggress against him. If
Mm-hmm.
I can disagree with him and and do all of my little voluntary things to shun him, and maybe that's the more effective way to
You
do
can
it.
also confront the racist if it's in public, right?
Sure, but what I'm saying is I can
Which is
punch him in the
applying
face
force in
or
defense as long as it's proportional, right?
yeah.
If somebody's saying a racist thing in public, you're like, hey, buddy, watch it. I mean, not everybody believes that, and you're just insulting people here. Like that's an appropriate amount of force in return to apply. So you
But my
could
point
engage with a
is
racist according to the NAP, properly.
But my point is you wouldn't say "Hey, buddy" to the rapist while he's raping. You know what I mean? You wouldn't just go, "Hey, buddy, that's not on." You know? Do you know what
You
I'm
would
saying?
probably start there, like to figure out what's going on. It's like you hear a commotion, and like, does someone need help? What's going on? Like you might start there, and it may escalate.
Well, I mean, and to be honest, that does hover on a very good point that Adam made when he was involved in our conversation as well, with regards to the fact that there's a lot of times, and I think his, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think a lot of his concerns come less from the idea of, enforcing the NAP, but more from he doesn't like the way that I kind of take this approach of, well, we can enforce the NAP against everybody, because I think he feels that there's a lot of ways in which that would be unwise. Like for the ways that you mentioned, maybe you're wrong. Maybe that person didn't violate the NAP, but you got the wrong end of the stick. Maybe you're violating the victim's consent because they actually want what's going on, or you know what I mean, or whatever. There's, and the further afield you go, the more risky such actions are taken. And I totally take all of those points. I'm not even disagreeing with those. My point really is about what we have the right to do. And my point with the racist and the rapist example is I have the right to use force against the rapist, but I don't have right to use force against the racist. And that's why I just like to draw that distinction. Like when you talk about, well, there's lots of consequences for NAP violations, even if we don't enforce after the fact, with force. My point is like, yeah, but that makes NAP violations no different to anything that we just don't like subjectively. The point about NAP violations is that's when we have the right to use force. So when it comes to things like rape, theft, murder, assault, and slavery, we actually have the right to use force to enforce prohibitions against that. Whereas I don't have right to enforce prohibitions against racist opinions. You know what I mean? Because that's people acting within. And just to kind of hover back to that sentence that I really think kind of sums up like the disagreement from my perspective, is when you say about like when people are exercising those rights, their natural rights, there's no prohibition. I agree with that sentiment, but I just simply state that the prohibition I'm talking about isn't within people exercising their natural rights. It's prohibiting everything outside of that paradigm. Do you see what I'm saying? So like I agree with you that when people are exercising their self-ownership, then yeah, no one has the right to step in and take their place. There is no prohibition within that paradigm, no just prohibition at least. I agree with you on that, but my point is that the prohibition that I am advocating for isn't within that. It's outside of that. It's literally outside of that. It's literally saying everything outside of that we have the right to prohibit, because people don't have the right to do it in the first place. So the prohibition is kind of implied by the principle. It's not our authority. It's not you're not allowed to rape because I said so. It's you're not allowed to rape because there's no coherent claim to have that right. You know what I mean? So that's kind of my point with this. It's like, yes, when people are exercising their self-ownership, nobody has the right to stop them from doing that because they're violating their rights. But when people are stepping outside of their self-ownership and violating the non-aggression principle, people do have the right to stop them, because those people didn't have the right to do what it is people are trying to stop them from doing through this enforced prohibition. And I understand there's a difference between before the fact and after the fact. I still think that part of that prohibition and that disincentive and that you're not allowed to do this should include after the fact responses, because I feel like you're misaligning the incentives. You would essentially be rewarding criminals for committing crimes by removing forceful consequences, not all consequences, because there's still the other consequences you mentioned, but forceful consequences. Like the rapist, while he's raping, he might be risking all manner of force used against him, but he knows that once he's finished, he's rewarded by the fact that no one's allowed to touch him and he can walk away, unscathed and all the rest of it. So sorry, I kind of threw a lot at you there, but just to go back to the sentence about what's within our rights and what's without, and I'm just saying, I don't feel like we're violating anybody's rights by prohibiting things that they don't have, that are outside of their rights. Does that make sense?
I understand the argument, and I'll disagree with it on this ground.
Okay.
If someone commits a crime, for you to then be able to use force after the fact, you are now giving yourself an extra right that you don't have.
How so?
you are claiming for yourself a right that you don't have. You're switching the framework so that the other person's perceived violation now gives you an extra right. Because under normal circumstances, I don't have the right to track somebody down, hunt them down, apprehend them, and put them in a cage or whatever. But if you're saying that, well, if there's a presupposition and a perception that this person has violated a prohibition, now suddenly I get this right to go after the person and apprehend them and maybe put them in a cage. Now you're using one person's breaking of a social norm to give you an extra claim that you ordinarily would not have. And that's where the statism comes in. Because statism is about a group of people magically getting more rights than any of them would have individually. So if you don't have the right to track someone down, apprehend them, and throw them in a cage, you don't magically get that right simply because you think that person committed a crime. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't get a magic, and this is the other reason why statism is so poisonous, because of the effect it has on the enforcers. And if I can go back to something you brought up when you were talking about my book, it's about the good cops. It's poisonous to the people who are now entrusted with getting these extra rights to go after people who've supposedly broken a prohibition. You know, good cops kill Jesus. Not bad cops, not rogue cops, not corrupt cops. Good cops. The ones who obey orders and follow their training and protocols. The ones who care about their communities and keep the streets safe and secure. The ones who are just doing their jobs and trying to go home to their families. Hey, they don't make the rules, they just enforce them. I didn't make the NAP, I'm just enforcing it. Stop resisting. Good cops kill Jesus. Such is the muck of good citizenship, and how the imposed hierarchical social order is established and maintained. It's what it does to the person who gets the mindset of, now I get to enforce. If your framework allows people, under the guise of enforcing a sanction against a prohibition, to now assume rights that they did not have before, now you are squarely into a statist system. Because that's what statism is. Claims and authorities that individuals don't have magically appear at the level of enforcement. That's the problem. It's not that you like the NAP. It's that you've interpreted the NAP as giving people an enforcement right that they don't have. Like, you don't have that. You don't magically get that extra right because someone else committed an infraction. Like, someone else, because then what you're saying is someone else's infractions change the NAP. Someone else's infraction now gives me an extra right that I didn't have before. I don't think so. Someone else's attempt at an infraction means that I may exercise a right I already had to self-defense. Yes. Someone else's known infraction gives me the right to avoid that person and not trade with them, not hire them, keep an extra eye on them when they're out and around near me. Yes. But that person's supposed infraction gives me a right that I previously did not have before their infraction to do stuff to them. That's statism. And maybe it's small-scale statism, but it's the framework and the mindset of the statism. And that's where you and I disagree. Like, we agree on the NAP being a good framework. We agree on the NAP being good principles. We agree on the power of agreement, even formal agreement and contract, to facilitate longer-term interactions with people. You know, signing a lease for 5 years rather than having to come back every day with all your stuff and say, can I rent for another day? You know, all of that we agree on. I disagree with the extra rights that are assumed for some frameworks of enforcement, because I think that steps outside of the NAP and therefore outside of true voluntarism and anarchism and consent-based interactions. And frankly, I believe that steps outside of Christian social interaction, which unfortunately self-identified Christians have not adhered to for most of Christian history. Like Christendom is a stain, I believe, on Christianity, because it was believed that, well, if someone makes an infraction, then we are ordained by God to punish them. So just, take away the God word and say, if someone commits an infraction, I am ordained by the NAP to, after the fact, go after them. It's the deification of the NAP, which is what government is. All governments are religions. So I think that's the disagreement that you and I have.
I understand your concern, and I think a lot of it's born with that kind of understanding that power corrupts, and but so I kind of agree with elements of that. The part where I disagree with is I don't think that it's giving you extra rights, because you have, whether it's a right or authority or whatever word you want to use, you have the right to do anything as long as you're not violating the rights of other people. And
Yes.
but my point about when you use force against the rapist or the murderer or the thief, as long as it is proportional and in relation to that offence before or after the fact, then you're not like I basically, I guess I'm rejecting your assertion that there's an extra right involved. Like you're saying, oh well, because he's done this, that's now granting you a right that you didn't have. But it's like I'm saying, well, no, it's not, because providing my force is focused related to what they're doing, I have the right to stop them from doing that. Not because of any special right I have, but just simply by the fact that they don't have the right to do that. And my point about the NAP and the whole idea of self-ownership and the freedom is, it's like you have the freedom to do and the right to do what you want with yourself and your rightfully owned property, as long as you're not infringing on those same rights of other people. But when you're using force to enforce prohibitions against rape, murder, theft, and assault, you're not infringing on the rights of other people, because they don't have the right to do those things. Whereas if you were using it to infringe on other activities that they do have the right to do, then you would. So that's where I kind of reject the idea that this is kind of, because I do understand your fear. It's the same kind of fear that I'm kind of wary of myself. This whole power corrupts thing. I've heard Christian nationalists use exactly what you were talking about by saying, God says I can say this. And I understand the point you're making, and it's a clever point, by saying the NAP ordains me, just in the way that the Christian nationalists say that their God ordains them to be able to violate other people. And you're saying, well, I'm saying the NAP is ordaining me to violate other people. But I get what you're saying, but the reason why I kind of reject that argument as it relates to what I'm proposing is I'm saying, yes, but enforcing the NAP isn't violating other people. Do you see what I mean? Like, enforcing prohibitions against rape, theft, murder, and assault isn't violating your rights, because you don't have the right to rape, rob, murder, and assault. You know what I mean? Whereas the prohibition against gambling or prostitution or smoking weed or whatever, that is an exercise of your natural rights, then I am guilty of that. But what I'm saying is, as long as the prohibition is only against things that you're literally not allowed to do according to this objective principle, then I just, like I say, I don't see how the rapist or the murderer or whatever they are has the right to complain, unless their complaint is that the force is disproportional to the crime, in which case then they can make the argument that you're making about, people are taking liberties and claiming authority that they don't have, and all the rest of it. But as long as the force is proportional or necessary in relation to prohibiting these specific crimes, then, and again, coming back to that sentence about there's no prohibition when people are exercising their self-ownership. My point is yes, but there is a prohibition when people are violating self-ownership. And that's, like I say, I feel like it's implied by the principle. It's the non-aggression principle. It's the don't rob, rape, murder, assault, and enslave people principle. So I feel like it is prohibiting it. All right, it's not a law, it's a principle. And there are people like Stephen Kinsella, I don't know if you know about his principles of liberty, universal principles of liberty, where he's kind of presented a peace agreement, not peace agreement, sorry, he's presented like an agreement on the principle without the law aspects. I mean, you probably like what he's presented because it's kind of like what I'm talking about.
I don't know much about it.
Well, the reason why I think you might like it is because it's a lot of what I'm talking about without that let's make it a law, without that abolition, prohibition. Although I think it would make a great precursor to what I'm trying to push, it's kind of like it's just presenting the principle. It's just giving people an opportunity to register their agreement and support for it, but it's not doing anything more than that. It's not saying let's enforce this as law, let's use this to abolish anything. It's just saying this is the principle, this is the implications of it, and here's an opportunity to kind of register your agreement with it. So that would probably be something that would be kind of like what I'm proposing, but without the things that you disagree with, which you feel like have status connotations. So something worth watching, and I'll put it in the notes for other people to look at.
I think it's still an act versus person thing, though. Like a crime is an act.
Yeah.
A crime is an act. And the reason why you're allowed to exercise defensive force is it's an act for an act. Once the act is over, then it becomes disproportionate to now initiate another act in enforcing the prohibition. Like, this is what where does the right of the enforcer after the fact come from? And you can't say it comes from the fact that there's an infraction.
Why not?
Because that's not where it comes from. It can't. Where does the right of the enforcer come from?
Why? Just to clarify, why it can't come from the violation? Because we agree that
if the violation's over, then the opportunity for proportional response is also over for that act.
Well, no, the opportunity to prevent it is over, but the opportunity for proportional response isn't over. I mean, response is...
Well, then what's the proportion, though?
What do you mean?
Well,
how would it be proportionate to the crime that's already been committed? If it's... I see what you're saying, because obviously force be used before the fact would be... let's say
someone's trying to steal something from you, you prevent the theft. It's proportional.
So the force is necessary to prevent it. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Someone stole something from you. Lots of people can see the guy getting away with it. They chase him down. It's like, hey, we all saw you do this. It's pretty obvious that you did it. And I mean, no one here is going to do business with you anyway. Let you in their neighborhood anymore, let you in their homes anymore. You might as well give it up. Now you're using proportional force. But the idea that there's an act committed from which you cannot, say, just have a compensation, like a direct compensation. It's like you stole a chair, okay, give him back a chair. You destroy the guy's car, pay for the repairs or get him a new car. It's like when that's out of play, when it's something like assault, rape, murder, where does the extra right of the enforcer come from after the fact? In the moment, obviously the right of self-defense is there. But where does the act of after the fact enforcement come from? And you can't say it comes from the person's infraction, because then you're saying that, well, one person violating a prohibition means that other people can violate the prohibition too. And now it's just, now nobody's actually adhering to the NAP anymore. Where does the right of the enforcer after the fact come from?
Well, where does the right come from to prevent it first?
Because it's a property right. My right to lock my door is that it's my property. And I have the better prior claim to it. Where is my right to not let someone punch me in the face, that I can duck or block it or use some sort of defensive move? It's a property and personhood right that I have.
But
Where does the right come from to track down the person after the fact and apprehend them? Like, I don't have the right to do that. I don't magically get that right because they did something to me in the past.
But is the threat of response not part of the prevention?
Is the threat of response
not the part of the prevention? Like saying you're not, like if I say you're not allowed to do something like rape, and you say, oh, well, what are you going to do if I do? And I say, well, after the fact, nothing. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, then
after the fact, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. You're going to be persona non grata in my store, in my home. I'm going to tell my neighbors about you.
Yeah, but I could say that if you said a word I don't like. You know what I mean? What I'm saying is,
yes, you could.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is
subjective values. The NAP allows for subjective values.
Yeah, but yes. what I'm saying is there's a difference between a NAP violation where we have the right to use force and a non-NAP violation where we don't have the right to use force.
How does a NAP violation give you the right to use force, though?
By the fact that you don't have the right to do the thing that I'm doing, using force to either prevent or in response of.
That's not where a right comes from. You're saying the right comes from the infraction.
Well, we're not. It's not that the right comes from the infraction. The right is always there. Like you have the right to do what you want as long as you're not violating other people. And my point is enforcing prohibitions against rape isn't violating other people because
Depends
they don't
on what
have
those
the right.
Prohibitions are and when it's enforced. That's my point. My point is that you don't have the right to use enforcement as a blanket term to cover for things that are actually disproportionate or themselves violations of the NAP.
Yeah, but I would argue that it wouldn't be disproportionate simply by applying force after the fact. Because otherwise...
Now you're committing the infraction.
But what's the infraction? That's my point. Like defensive force...
Hunting somebody down and apprehending them, that's the infraction.
Well, but not if you're doing so in protection of rights. Like
there's no way to do that to protect rights. You're now stepping outside of protecting rights.
Well, I don't think you are, because you're punishing somebody who's violating rights for violating rights. Like it's directly related to that.
Punishment is not part and parcel to rights. The NAP is not a blanket cover for punishing people who violate the NAP.
Sorry, say that again, sorry.
The NAP is not a blanket justification for punishing people who violate it.
No, it's not a blanket justification, but there is a proportional justification as long as it's proportional to the crime that's committed.
No, that's not the NAP either. The NAP is non-aggression. It's not I get to aggress if you aggressed first. That's not the principle. It's not eye for an eye. It's not eye for an eye.
Well, it's not mandated,
so I get to do something to you.
Well, it's not mandated by the principle, but it is implied that it's allowed within the principle.
No, it's not.
Well, I would argue that it is, because the non-aggression principle prohibits you from initiating force against peaceful people. If you're acting in response to force, that's not initiating force against peaceful people. If you're acting in response,
it's not the principle that prevents you from doing it. The principle is an orientation that you have that influences your actions. The NAP doesn't. A person would have to act or avoid or pursue or evade or initiate or react, respond. The NAP doesn't do it at all. The NAP does nothing.
No, the NAP is just the principle of whether it's right or wrong what you're doing.
And you're changing the principle if you say if someone violates the NAP, then it's appropriate to violate the NAP in reaction as long as it's a proportional violation.
Well, no, because I mean the way that I'm don't see it that way is that I'm saying I'm not saying it's proportional to violate the NAP in response to somebody violating the NAP. I'm saying that force that's used in response to NAP violations isn't a NAP violation.
But it is if it's after the fact.
I disagree, because I don't think that we can incentivize and reward criminals for successfully committing crimes by
the NAP
then
is
freeing
not concerned
them
with the incentives for criminals.
Okay, fair enough. That's fair enough. But the NAP is concerned with where our rights begin and end, And
Yes.
the prohibition that the NAP is that we don't have the right to initiate force against peaceful people because that's a violation of their rights. It doesn't say that we don't have the right to use force against people that are violating the principle because that's defensive force, that's protecting rights.
Not if it's
Even
after
if,
the fact.
well, it is. Well, the thing is, I would say that it is if it's after the fact, because if someone commits a crime, they're already proving their intent for future offences. So
No, they're
you could,
not.
okay,
No,
no,
they're not. There's always a first time offender, right?
yeah,
So that means that their previous peaceful behavior should have proved that they would never have committed a crime. But there's always a first time for a first of an offense. So no, you cannot carry this stuff into the future as if it's a status and
okay.
claim that it's an NAP, that it squares with an NAP principle. It's the enforcement that's the problem. It's always enforcement after the fact that creeps you into statism.
So okay, but so
If
if a
you want to
thief,
live by the NAP, then you have to live with crime. Just like if you live under statism, you live under crime. It's just official crime. If you want to live under by the non-aggression principle, then you have to accept that things will go wrong, and that people will be criminals, and that some people will see that and respond to the incentives to get away with things. But if you adhere to the NAP, then you have to find ways of expressing your adherence to it without becoming the criminal. And it's not like, well, if they do it first, then I'm not the criminal if I respond. Yeah, you could be. The
yeah,
only way
but
you're not is if you're responding to the act and not the person. That's why you can respond in the commission of a violation, because there you're technically not responding to the person, you're responding to the act that is in the process of being committed. But once the act is over, now you're not proportionally responding to the act anymore. You're responding to the person and to the status you've applied to the person. That's why defensive force is allowable in an NAP mindset in the moment, because in the moment you're responding to the act, not the person. But once the act is over, you're responding to the person.
are you
And
still
now
not?
you don't have the right of that kind of enforcement.
Are you still not also responding to the act though?
No, the act's done.
Yeah, but that's what a response is. A response is afterwards. If it was before, then it wouldn't be a response. It would be preemptive.
Response is while it's happening, though. Action and reaction happen all the time. You
Yes,
and I
but
are having a conversation right now, right? You
yeah, but
act, I act, you
reaction
act, I
doesn't
act.
precede action. Reaction is after action. So, like a response by nature would be after the fact.
But
Like,
it's
like if you
ongoing.
punch me in the face, my response to that might be whatever to punch you back. But my point is if you punch me in my if you punch me in my face, anything I did before that isn't a response to you punching me in my face. It might be a response
Correct.
to you trying to, like, I catch your fist
Yes.
or whatever.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is the response to the act is
Mhm.
after the fact, because that's what a response is. It's the reaction.
Yes. But a
It's
response is to the initiation of the act, which is ongoing. Now, once the act is done, now you're not responding to the act anymore.
well, I'd say you are. You're just not responding to the initiation anymore. Like when you, if I before you punch me,
But it's
I'm
completed.
responding to the initiation or the attempt or the the punch is still in progress. After you've punched me, then what I do after that, whether it's punch you back, grab you, whatever, then that is a response, and that response is a response to you doing that. I'm not grabbing you because you're a puncher. You know what I mean? I'm grabbing you because you punched me. I'm acting in response to that specific act. And if and as long as my response can be considered either proportionate or necessary to the enforcement, again, to in response to that you punching me in the face or whatever, as long as I don't go beyond that, like tie you up and torture you or do a whole bunch of things that are neither proportionate or necessary related to the act. That's why I say it's not like just because I get what you're saying about like just because someone violates the non-aggression principle doesn't mean it's carte blanche for us to just do what we want to them. My point is when someone violates the non-aggression principle, we have the right to use force, which I would say is defensive force, both before and after the fact. Now, I understand where you disagree that it's only before the fact. And I get the point that obviously before the fact, there's a clear prevention of the violation, whereas
but even in the act, there's a clear mitigation of it.
Yeah, but then after the fact, I take your point that it's too late to prevent it. But my point is that doesn't mean our right of response just ends and they're rewarded for completing their crime with no forceful accountability. I know there's other accountability we can apply, because like I say, then you're saying that the non-aggression, then you're saying it's a violation of the non-aggression principle to retaliate to aggression. And I don't think that's the case, because then that would make the non-aggression principle almost, not quite, and I don't want to strawman you, but it would make it almost pacifism, with the only difference between the non-aggression principle and pacifism being the right to prevent the aggression, whereas pacifism, I don't think you even would allow for defense before the fact. But my point is the non-aggression principle isn't pacifism. The non-aggression principle prohibits you from initiating force against peaceful people, not using proportionate response against criminal aggressors who are violating rights, because the enforcement of that prohibition is just to protect rights. As long as it is, like I say, centered and focused on those specific acts and not just some kind of carte blanche excuse to do other things to them that's not related to the crime, that's not considered proportional or necessary. So
the peaceful people peaceful people part is the problem.
Okay.
The non-aggression principle is not a personal prohibition against violating the rights of peaceful people. It's a personal prohibition against violating the rights of anyone, whether or not you define them as peaceful. It is the defense part is you're allowed to stop violations which are acts, but you are not allowed to, after the fact, initiate a new act against the perceived or actual violator. That's the problem of enforcement, is that in the moment, each individual person who might be violated is a de facto enforcer in the moment. But after the fact, the NAP does not provide for any kind of enforcement. And if you keep thinking about it in terms of rewards and incentives, you're not going to be satisfied with that answer. But the NAP is not about rewards and incentives.
Yeah, no, I take that point, and that's not an argument on the principle. That's just a commentary on the implications.
I favor self-defense because it happens in the moment, and perhaps the extended moment while an extended act is taking place. Like someone doesn't break into your house in an instant. It takes time. Then they got to rummage through and find stuff. The only time stealing happens in an instant is maybe with electronic crime. Someone empties your bank account in an instant. And now, maybe you're in a race against time to track down where those funds came from and can you identify them and can you reverse the transaction. But for most, especially person-to-person infractions, it happens in a process, not an instance. And there's a beginning and an end to the process. And if you have the ability, the capacity, and want to respond anywhere in there, proportionally, yes, you can. But once it's over, you are now becoming the initiator if you then go in force after the fact. If you really adhere to the NAP, then you have to put up with the fact that other people are going to take incentives that you wouldn't take.
But how
evil always benefits people. Crime always benefits people. That's why they do it. But the reason for having an NAP is to say it stops with me.
But how can
one person's crime does not grant me an enforcement right, which is really just another aggression. That's the purpose of the NAP.
But my point is like, how can you say that, like, an after the fact response to like a rapist or a murder, how can you say that that's initiating force? Like,
because
surely they initiated force with their rape or their murder or whatever.
yes, and that was wrong.
So yeah, but then responding to that isn't initiating force. It's responding
Yes, it
to it.
is.
But they
Responding
initiated. You
after the
can't.
fact is initiating.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because I feel
If
like
someone's trying to assault you and you can fight them off in the moment, then you have responded in the fact. If you if you aren't successful in doing that, then you are not the NAP does not give you cover after the fact for you to then initiate something against them.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I suppose.
Because then that's aggression. The other thing is you're completely flipping where rights come from. You started with rights come from self-ownership.
Yeah.
But now you're saying that so it originates my ability to act comes from me, some capacity I have. And now you're switching it saying, well, now I'm allowed to do something because of something that guy did.
Well, yeah, but I'm not saying that I'm getting an extra right from that. I'm saying that, like, I don't have the right to stop that guy from doing anything that's within his rights to do.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is, when he does something that's not within his rights to do, then I have the right to use force against him, because he's doing something he doesn't have the right to do. Do you see what I'm saying?
But that's not the cause.
I
That's
understand
not
that,
what gives you the right to respond. What gives you the right to respond is that you have that valid claim already. You don't get an extra right because someone else committed a crime.
But I don't think it's an extra right, though, because what I'm saying is I don't like because the thing is the simple act of grabbing someone and throwing them to the floor on its own isn't necessarily it depends on the context, whether or not that's an act of initiating force against somebody.
A game of American football, that's not a violation of rights.
Okay, well, yes, but also
it's a good tackle.
Well, okay, yeah, but also grabbing somebody who's in the process of raping or murdering somebody and throwing them to the floor, you would also agree is not a violation of rights, because you're in the, doing it before
Correct.
the fact. Okay, and my point
is, the fact. It's before the fact is preventative. After the fact is enforcement. Within the fact is where the proportional self-defense can come in, or the immediate defense of the other.
But what my point is like, the act of committing some kind of force isn't itself, divorced of context, isn't itself necessarily a NAP violation. You could grab somebody and throw them on the ground, like you say, as part of a game you're playing or whatever that you both volunteered to be, consented to be a part of, or you could do it in the context of the force that we both agree is allowable with regards to preventing a crime while it's happening, or before it, as it's about to happen, or something like that. So then the grabbing the person and throwing them to the ground is again within your rights. Whereas if that person was just we're talking before the fact, like they're raping. Going back to the point where I thought we agreed.
Yeah, if you're in a bar and somebody starts pounding on another person, and you don't know who the aggressor is, but you know this guy's getting pounded, so you just separate them. You pull one guy off the other and you separate. Like, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right. No, that's not a violation.
Forget the ambiguity a minute. Let's go back to something certain. There's a person being raped. You've got to be on. You're pretty certain that that's what's happening. And I think we both established that we both agree that before the fact and during the act, we're allowed to use force to stop them, because it is actually stopping them. So my point is the mere act of using the force of grabbing them and throwing to the ground in that context also wouldn't be a violation of your rights. Where, like, in the context of the football game, it's not a violation of your rights because they consented to that force. In the context of the stopping a rape while it's happening or as it's about to happen, you're not violating the rights because you're preventing them from doing something that they don't have the right to do.
You're protecting the right of the victim in the moment.
Yes, yeah. And where we're parting company, I'm just pinpointing where we're disagreeing here, is where we're disagreeing is I'm saying that once they've committed that act, if I grab them and threw them to the ground so that they could be held, like because they've just committed this crime. I'm saying that I'm still not violating the non-aggression principle because I have still not acted in violation of somebody else's right. I haven't initiated force. The rapist initiated force, and I've acted in response to that act. After the fact, too late to stop it, but still within my rights because I'm, like I say, the act of grabbing someone and throwing them to the ground isn't a violation just because I'm using force. It's only a violation if, when I'm doing that, I am violating their rights. And because they don't have the right to rape, I know we agreed before the fact and during the fact, but I'm saying also after the fact, because they didn't have the right to do that, my right to use the force against them doesn't stop just because it's too late to prevent the act. It's still a response to them. Like, I'm not initiating force. They initiated force when they committed the rape. Does that make sense? Before you tell me whether you agree, which I think you don't, but does that make sense? Do you understand the point I'm making on that?
I understand the logic you're going through, but again, you're getting a right from someone else's perceived violation of a right. And that's not really where rights come from in the NAP.
Okay. Okay.
It's an enforcement issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand.
It's always an enforcement issue. Like the NAP is not about rewards and incentives. The
Yeah.
NAP, a society run on the NAP is going to be a messy society that has crime, because everybody's going to wonder, how much can I get away with? Or a lot of people are. Some people won't, but some people are. And
So,
once you realize that a society is run by the non-aggression principle, if you're not a person who likes the non-aggression principle, you may see some easy prey there. So yeah, so the NAP by itself does not guarantee a just society.
oh, for sure. And to
It
clarify,
cannot.
and to
It
clarify,
can't.
yeah,
Right?
and to clarify, prohibiting rape doesn't guarantee that there's no rapes. As we can see, there's already laws
Correct.
against rape, and rape still happens. But the
Yes.
point of the matter is we don't allow it. It doesn't mean we can magically stop it, but we don't formally allow it. We use force to stop it both before and after the fact. Just to kind of wrap up, because we've been going for quite a while, and I really
Sure.
appreciate it. I love,
You
like
may
I
have
said,
to break this into several episodes. I don't know how long.
well,
I don't have a clock in view of me now, but I have no. But we've been talking for a while. It's been fun. Thank you.
I think we're approaching 3 hours, so I think we'll probably
Oh
wrap.
boy, we've Roganed it.
But it's been great, and I really
Yeah,
appreciate it. And perhaps we can have another conversation in the future. And we've
sure.
both given. Hopefully, you've certainly given me food for thought. Hopefully, I've given you some and stuff to chew on. I suppose just to kind of round things up and finish things off. I suppose a couple of little questions I just kind of want to throw at you, just to kind of help
Sure.
me clarify where you're coming from. So,
Sure.
if let's just say, for argument's sake, that I had the exact same opinion of you with regards to this before and after thing. So let's say
Okay.
I agree with you that. Would my idea of establishing the NAPA's law, understanding that enforcement couldn't be done after the fact, would you be on board with that, or would there still be an issue for you? Like this whole abolishing rape, but obviously no after the fact thing, or prohibiting, or whatever language you'd feel more comfortable. But the fact of having a formalized agreement that you're not allowed to rape, rob, assault, thing, and all the rest of it, assuming we didn't have this disagreement over the issue of after the fact, forceful responses, assuming we were on the same page that this only applied to preventing it beforehand, would you be in agreement with such a proposal? Or if not, what would be your problem with it?
Like signing a pledge.
Well, however it's done, just the simple fact that, like, you live in a society where through, I mean, like I say, the way I would do it is through the terms of the peace agreement. Like a bit like how international law is, except it's between people, not states. But like, rather than it being the dictates of a ruling authority, it's just like these terms of peace. It's like a law that's like formally established in that way. You live in that society. The NAP is the law. So you're not allowed to do NAP violations. That's what it's basically saying. It won't do nothing to you after you've done it, but it will enforce, like we've just spoken about, before or during. Force will be used against you. What's the objection to that, if you have one?
I let's say I was going to move to one of these free cities, and I know it's basically it becomes a property right thing, and they have look, these are the agreements to live here in our free city, and if I looked over them, and they were basically a lot like the NAP, like no stealing, no assaulting, life, liberty, property, all respected. This is the property where you're leasing or buying within the larger piece of property. Yeah, I would think so.
Let's just
I
sorry.
don't think it's necessary to.
Let me just change the example a little bit because I do just want to
Sure,
pin you down on. I'm trying to pinpoint, where
sure.
so let's change the example. Just change that example you gave. Instead of you moving somewhere, because that
Mhm.
implies sort of consent to rules ahead
Sure.
of time and all the rest of it. So you've not moved anywhere. You're just where
Okay.
you are, and
Mhm.
society around you has changed enough that this law has been formally established. So it's now people are now saying you're not allowed to violate the NAP. You're not allowed to rob, rape, murder, assault, and enslave. Whatever you say about under whose authority, they're just saying, well, no one's authority. We're just not going to let you do it. We'll use force to stop you. My point is there? Would you have an objection to that? Would you be able to say, well, that's wrong because of such and such?
Um, I'd always ask, well, how would you enforce it? I would always have an objection to the enforcement.
But assuming we agreed on the enforcement side of it, assuming we had that conversation, obviously we don't agree on the enforcement side of it because as we've just gone through, you only agree with enforcement, to the point of
Yeah.
prevention, and then afterwards feel that it's no longer allowable for the NAP. I disagree with that, but let's just, for argument's sake, imagine that I didn't disagree with that, and I had the exact same. I was presenting the exact.
Mhm.
So I'm basically, imagine I'm presenting the Nations of Sanity project exactly as I am, but the only difference is we don't disagree on this after the fact response thing. So
Mhm.
the implications of enforcing the NAPA's law would only be before or during the act.
I wouldn't have to sign that.
No, no, I'm not
Like
saying you have to sign it, but would you have an objection? Like what I'm saying is
no,
if
if people act in the world properly, no, of course I don't have an objection to it. No,
but then saying that you can't do these things.
that I personally would not have an objection to it because I already don't do those things.
Well, yeah, I understand that. I understand that you don't want to do those things, but I suppose I'm just talking about
It
because.
becomes like Penn Jillette,
But
you
I suppose
know.
I'm just pinpointing your objection to the Nations of Sanity. Like we've made a lot of progress because we've obviously identified this
I don't
element
know
of
that I know
enforcement.
enough about your project. I mean, my objection in this conversation is to the enforcement.
Yeah, but like in our previous conversations, obviously you've objected to the idea of like abolition and prohibition and stuff like that. And my point is like, well, all I'm talking about is saying you're not allowed to do these things. And the fact is you're not allowed to do these things. Like you don't have a right to do these things. And if a society said that they were going to use force to stop you, I don't think you would have any principle-based objection. I know you personally don't want to commit these crimes
Yes.
anyway, but I'm just saying from a ethical point of view, like I guess what I'm saying is from this conversation, I feel like the only objection that I've really pulled out of you for what I'm proposing is the after the fact enforcement. Like
Yes.
that's the only real objection I've really kind of pinpointed. So would it be fair to say that you kind of don't necessarily have, I'm not asking you to endorse it with
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
caveat, but just sort of say like, would it be fair to say that if we agreed on that point, if establishing the NAPA's law and enforcing it as law was only done in a before the fact manner, would you feel that that's okay? And it's only the after the fact level, or do you have an objection to the prohibition within itself? Like, I don't think
Uh,
you do, but I'm just trying to kind of clarify that.
I don't have an objection to naturally occurring non-crimes where people just don't commit crimes.
Yeah.
I don't go around, oh man, I wish there were some more people committing crimes around here. Like I don't do that at all. So yeah, if the people around me um, wake up, to use a term that's probably overused in modern society and parlance. If the people around me suddenly wake up and start living out the non-aggression principle, yeah, I'd be pleased with it. And if they said explicitly to me, yeah, we've discovered the non-aggression principle and we want to live by it. Great. Yeah. Good, do that. Now, if they told me, well, and then we have these other things that we're going to build on top of it, I'd say, okay, well, what are those? And I'd have to ask for more of that. Like, would I abide by it if they abide? But would I? That's what contracts are, right?
Yeah.
Is people say, well, I have this and I'll offer it to you if you will offer this to me and we'll exchange. I go to the grocery store, apples are $1 a pound. If I buy them, that means that I wanted the exchange. If I don't buy them, it means I don't want the exchange. So like the offer is there, but it doesn't mean that either one of us has to do it. So the NAP is about people. Whether you use the language of the NAP or anything else, I'm all for people respecting each other's personhood and the space that involves, because we're all physically embodied people. We're not just ideas floating around.
Yeah.
Like, we're real people. We have space. That's where the right of property comes from. The fact that, yes, we do need physical things in the world in order to survive, to live, to thrive. We interact in that way. So that's where the right of property comes from. I have no problem with anybody adhering to natural human rights and setting an example. And that also means I don't have a problem with people adhering to natural human rights who do so in ways that I don't. I'm not much of a visual artist, but if someone else wants to be a great visual artist and, wants to turn their property into an art studio or whatever, great, even though I wouldn't do it. There are people who consume media that I don't want to consume, but if they're not being violent, I'm fine with it. I've never seen the NAP or natural human rights as a way to make society more homogenous.
Oh, no, I
I think
agree.
that's terrible and anti-human.
If anything, I actually think it would be the opposite effect, because with the freedom to act with our self-ownership, we'd have more freedom to be more diverse and
Yes,
yeah, I
right?
think
Isn't that wonderful? Wouldn't that be wonderful? And wouldn't that be a shock to all the people who think they're making society more homogenous?
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, how come people are different?
Well,
I thought we were making everyone the same.
Well, it's a little bit
That's
like,
another place where you and I agree, where we think freedom brings out people's individuality and not people's conformity.
yes.
And
Well,
I think that's a beautiful thing, whether it's however you phrase it, and whether you phrase it as good neighbor, bad citizen, or a nation of sanity. If you favor natural human rights and respect that this might enhance people's differences rather than collapse them into some, everybody's just a microcosm of the perfect person, then yeah, I think we each agree from maybe a different starting point, but yeah, I think we agree on a lot of that.
well, I mean, I think, and I will wrap up now, because and it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you for
You've given me 3 hours of great pushback, and I've enjoyed learning about your work. I've enjoyed you scrutinizing mine. Really appreciate it. I hope we can speak again about it.
mutual
Yeah,
sentiment there. Yes.
really good. And there and just to finish off, there is a lot that we agree on, which is why I so appreciate exploring where we disagree, because I can have a conversation with somebody that just shares no values with me, and there wouldn't be that much value in where they disagree, because I know they disagree with me on anything anyway. But when I come across people who agree with me and understand these principles to such a degree, then I feel there's real value in exploring where we disagree, because I feel like we can kind of really kind of explore that. And just to kind of put like I say, anyone watching this and listening to this, check out Good Neighbor, Bad Citizen. That's one of the many areas where me and Domenic do agree. With and as I say, it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. I recommend it to other people, and I recommend Dominic's work in general on Substack. There's a lot of great work going there. As you say, we agree on a lot of things. We both agree on the principle, the self-ownership. The disagreement, as I say, I think the NAP can and should be enforced as law, and I do obviously think that includes after the fact responses. And I suppose the only thing I'll finish on is I also want to live in a world, that's the NAP. I wouldn't mind living in a society that's based on the golden rule as well. But I suppose the difference is, as much as I like the golden rule, I don't feel like I can force it on people. Whereas I do feel like I can force the nap on people simply because people aren't allowed to violate the nap by their rights. I know you disagree with that, but that's just me summing up my kind of position on it. Is I feel like we can force the nap because enforcing the nap is just protecting rights and is defensive force. And I know you agree with that before the fact, maybe not after. But as I say, that's why this has been such an interesting conversation for me, because there is so much we agree on. It was really fun exploring this area of disagreement, and I hope I've given you some food for thought, as well as to everybody that's listening. Please check out Dominic's work. I'll put links in the description for it. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you, Domenic, for taking the time.
Thank you, Matthew.
You're welcome.